What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals, the Judgment Day event. And this story, here's the thing, this first issue pops off. I mean, it's just like, boom, it hits hard. What this initially does here is it picks up with a kind of discussion between Tony Stark and Cersei of the Eternals. Now, one of the things to know is that for a lot of new comic book readers, this is cool. If you are an older comic book reader, this is a throwback to like the 80s and 90s, right? This is a throwback to the days when like Cersei and the Eternals were far more involved with human affairs than we've seen recently, specifically Cersei. She's been very, very important when it came to just the overall history of the Avengers, the X-Men, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff there. And so it's kind of cool to see because it takes me on a bit of a nostalgia trip from way back in the day. But the thing about this is that there's kind of a conversation that's going on between the two. Now, one of the things to know is that Cersei, while her and Tony Stark have, of course, been together physically a variety of times and so on, she never really took them all that seriously. And that's because despite all of his vaunted intelligence and all that kind of stuff, Tony Stark never really took himself all that seriously, right? He's a jokester. He's a playboy, right? He's the guy, he's got it where it counts, but he just kind of passes himself off and puts himself off as the guy that never takes anything seriously, so nobody ever really takes him seriously. That's one of the reasons why the Civil War story was so important, is because it was one of the very few stories that you've seen over the course of Marvel's publication history that focus on Iron Man outside of like Demon in a Bottle or Armor Wars or something like that, that showed a very serious side of Tony Stark, which was really, really cool. But the thing about this is that as they're having this conversation, there is a bit of a discussion about how effectively the Eternals are now aware of the fact that the X-Men have the power of resurrection. Now, this was actually brought to the Eternals by way of someone named the Jack of Knives. Jack of Knives is an Eternal. Basically, Jack is one of the Eternal crime lords, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this video, is how the Eternals roster and the overall system is kind of expanded really under the writing of Kieran Gillen, of course, largely being done most likely as a result of the MCU. But that when that information was brought to the Eternals, the question is, well, what do we do with this now? And initially, the Eternals were like, who cares? It doesn't really matter. That was until the concept of excess deviation was brought in, which is that mutants are basically an offshoot of the deviants. That somewhere along the line, a deviant gene entered the human genome, likely through procreation, and that all mutants that exist now are basically a result of humans possessing a deviant gene. That's what the X gene is. Now, I have, ever since this was introduced, we did a video on Geek Culture Explained where it's like, that's Marvel, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's end for mutants in the MCU. That's how they're going to introduce them. They're going to say the mutants are basically just an offshoot of the deviants. Done, right? That's why this is being done. There's no other reason to alter the entire history and the origin of mutants outside of that. There's really no reason to do that. So the fact that they're doing it here, that's what really changes things. That's why it matters, is because it's going to become an MCU thing. But in the midst of this conversation, suddenly you end up having basically Cersei, who's taken by like Echo and Thor and Captain Marvel, basically like attacked and whisked away. Now, the reason why this is done, why she's overpowered, is because Cersei, if you're going to take her out, you've got to be quick, because Cersei is a matter manipulator. She's not universe-wide. She can't alter reality on a universal scale, but she can alter the structure of people she's facing off against, knock them unconscious, any number of things. So if they attacked her and the battle went on for more than like a minute, Cersei would basically get the upper hand with a quickness. That's how powerful she is, right? Somebody who's able to overcome basically almost anybody up to a particular limit, most earthbound people. And so that basically allows the Avengers to take Cersei away. And so what this does is it switches over to the X-Men at the Treehouse in New York. Now remember, for those of you guys who are catching up with us, the Treehouse is basically the X-Men's field base in the city of New York. They do exist in Krakoa, but the Treehouse is kind of like a field base, right? It's where they can operate out of. Specifically, the main X-Men team, Cyclops, Jean Grey, different things like that. Now, what's kind of funny here, and this is something that has not been explicitly addressed yet at the time that this comic was launched, is that Cyclops is basically in his normal garb. He's not Captain Krakoa. So we're still fleshing out exactly how that works in relation to the greater landscape. Because remember, Cyclops' death was public. People aren't supposed to know he's still alive. But one of the things that gets talked about here is the fact that the story of Ben Urich that we had covered previously, which was him basically revealing to the world that the mutant population has the ability to resurrect themselves, that this has become known, and not everybody has reacted to it in a positive way. Some people have reacted to this in a predictable way, which is that, oh my God, the mutants have the ability to come back to life. Well, now they're more of a threat than they ever were. Whereas other people are reacting to it with with anger, right? Like, a woman's daughter is still dead. How come the X-Men get to come back and her daughter doesn't? The reality here, though, is that Cyclops goes as far as to say that the Five can only really bring back certain people, specifically those whose minds have been backed up by Cerebra. That's one of the caveats that was established during Hickman's run, that if they brought back this woman's dead daughter, she would just be a body with no memory of who she was before. Literally, she'd be just kind of teaching her everything new. So it'd be her daughter who had returned, but her daughter wouldn't know who she was. Again, it's one of those things where Cyclops isn't saying that the Five can't bring them back literally, it's the Five can't bring them back as they know them, which is what they want. They want, that woman wants her daughter to come back as she knew her daughter, that kind of a thing. And so what ends up going on here is you basically have a kind of meeting between Nightcrawler and Destiny and Mystique. Now remember, what's been going on since the return of Destiny is Marvel's largely been building on her ability to see the future. Now, the way that Marvel plays this, and it's one of the coolest things about it, Destiny has a wide and varying way in which her ability to predict the future works. The most popular version, and the one that there was an entire story arc based around, was called Destiny's Diaries. Basically, these instances where she had written down how things could play out in the future, and it was people's desire to find those diaries so they could ensure that things unfolded in the way they wanted to, or stop particular things from happening. And so what this does is it kind of segues into the modern era, which is if something's going to happen in 10 minutes, Destiny knows right off the bat. If something's going to happen in a day or in a week or a month, she can predict it pretty accurately. But if we're talking about something in 50 years, it may or may not come to fruition, because a lot of things can happen in the span of 50 years that can prevent that from happening. Specifically, what Destiny does here is she says the Eternals are coming, right? The Eternals are going to try to kill us all. This war is right around the corner. It's like right there, and I can see it coming. And so in response to that, Nightcrawler basically travels to Araco, right? Travels to Mars, and then essentially tells Storm and Magneto and all those guys, we have to assemble the Quiet Council. We've got to assemble the Great Circle, or the Great Ring in Araco, basically their governing body. We have to make sure people know the Eternals are coming for us all. The thing about this is that Destiny does not specifically know why the Eternals are going to do it. She simply just knows that they are, right? That she's predicted that they are going to go to war with the mutants, and if the mutants are not prepared, they're all going to die. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's kind of approached in different ways. Storm herself is like, okay, we have to approach this from more of a political standpoint. How do we deal with this on a political perspective? Magneto's whole stance is we'll confront this force when it comes head on. And he even goes so far as to say that like the Eternals are the old gods, right? They were created by the Celestials, these beings that were supposed to keep the world safe and all that kind of stuff. We've moved beyond them. We don't need the protection of the Eternals. We have our own cure for death, right? We've solved the equation of resurrection. We are more powerful than they are, and we're larger in number than they are. They're simply launching this attack against us because, much like the humans, they're afraid of their own mortality. We represent the next stage of not really just evolution, but the next stage of moving beyond them, right? If they are our parents, we are the children ready to step out into the world. And he even goes as far as to say, we are the world's new gods now. And so that's kind of the funny thing, because at that point, you transition to Avengers Mountain, which is where, at least is a place deep inside the mountain, where essentially no telepathic abilities will work. So no one can read the mind of Iron Man and Cersei. I mean, she can read his mind, I guess, but she can't telepathically call for help. Literally, it's one of those things where it's like, no one can hear you scream. There's no one you can call for, so you better start answering my questions. And again, she just doesn't really take him seriously. You know, she's literally mocking him. You know, he's like, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? And that kind of a thing. And she's like, I would never be in your shoes because, you know, they don't look good, right? They wouldn't look good on me. That's when the conversation gets serious, where he's like, I'm not joking here. I'm not dicking around. I'm not goofing off, right? Like, I am serious here. I am 100% serious, right? Like, I totally get that you are doing your thing, that like you as Eternals, you have your own society, you're not really a family, you have your own campaigns and what have you, and you do your stuff. And that's fine, right? It's always been that way. You do your thing, we do our thing. You don't show up for every Avengers Crisis event, and we don't show up for every Eternals event. But it becomes an Avengers problem when we find out that Thanos exists on Earth, that he's here and he's running the Eternals. Right now, at the moment, Thanos has been defeated, but that entire story arc, right, where Thanos was on Earth and running the Eternals never told the Avengers. And the response of Iron Man is, this is a problem. Not only that, Earth was minutes away from destruction, and at no point did you tell us what was going on. That's when it becomes a problem, right? So these are kind of two different events happening at the same time. And so ultimately, the response of Cersei is, I regret that. And Iron Man's like, that's the problem, Cersei. You regret it, but you're not sorry about it. There's no apology here, right? You don't even say it was a mistake. your regret was not the fact that you didn't tell us. Your regret was that we found out. That's the issue that you have, and that's why this is a problem. And so ultimately, because of how this interrogation is going, in the end, Captain America shows up here. Now, this is a great moment because what it does is it highlights how Captain America is viewed by everybody, right? He literally shows up and he's just like, this method of interrogation isn't working, Tony Stark. And here's the thing, Cersei was an Avenger at one point. We have to show her some level of trust. And he tells her, the Eternals are going to war with the X-Men. Tell us what you know. And Cersei, again, plays the same card she did with Iron Man, where she's like, well, I mean, I know that war is significantly more likely now that you've strapped me to this uncomfortable and unfashionable chair. And Captain America just looks at her. And that's when she realizes, okay, this is serious. That's the nature of Steve Rogers. And it's a very easy thing to overlook. It's one of those things, you look at Captain America and it's like, I mean, he's cool. He can run fast and punch hard. Wahoo, right? He'd make a great Olympian. You know, the USA champion in whatever competition he happens to be in. But the truth about this is because of the things that Captain America's done over his time as a superhero, and because of his standing among just anybody on Earth, human, mutant, eternal, otherwise, everybody respects him. And they know that when Captain America gets serious, when he stops joking, that's when things are a problem. And that's why Cersei stops. She drops the act and she's like, you're serious. A war, an actual war. And so she's like, what do you know? Right? Like, you have to know something. You wouldn't just kidnap me, bring me here, and then tell me a war is coming without having something to verify that's the case. And that's when Iron Man's like, okay, so since everything popped off with Thanos and we learned about all that stuff, we've basically been monitoring all Eternal activity. And what we found is that there was basically celestial energy that spiked and then ended, like almost immediately. And the response of Cersei is, but that's not weird. Like, cosmic energy, like literally your Fantastic Four have cosmic energy. That's not uncommon. And his response is, these are like a series of low-level rumblings that are happening around the world. Something's warming up. Something in the earth is coming. And because of the fact that you as Eternals have celestial energy, right? You're powered by cosmic energy and you've been here for like 1,000,000 years. Who else is it gonna be? Right? And so it's like, what are you doing? What do you have going on? And the response of Cersei is, here's the thing you need to understand. We as Eternals, we're a society. We're not a family, right? We don't owe anything to each other. We use the terms of familiar relations, mother, father, brother, sister, but we use that as a stand-in for teammate, right? We use it in that capacity. We consider ourselves, I guess, a family to a degree because there is a finite number of us. There will never be any more Eternals. They're not being created anymore. We cannot die. We'll always come back, but we can leave at any point in time. And some of us have. Some of us have abandoned the Eternals and we've taken up residence with the Deviants. So here's the thing you need to understand. I'm not the Eternal that you have to worry about here. And so what you do is you switch over to Olympia, the capital of the Eternal City, and you have Druig, who is the Prime Eternal. He's the one running the show, addressing basically what will become the Unimind and essentially saying, here's the problem. We as Eternals were created for the purpose of, one, keeping the deviant population in check, and two, correcting excess deviation, which is a time where the deviant gene becomes corrupted, right? Like when deviants experience a mutation of their own, essentially. But unlike the human population that experiences a mutation and they develop a healing factor, or they become Charles Xavier who can read minds, when a traditional deviant undergoes excess deviation, they turn into some grotesque monster and actually start killing other deviants. We eliminate them. And he's like, but here's the problem. Somewhere along the line, the deviant gene entered the human gene pool, and now mutants are excess deviation. Our job to follow our charter, the task assigned to us by the Celestials, if we are going to correct, i.e. eliminate excess deviation, we have to kill the mutants. So I am asking the Unimind to vote on this. I'm asking the Unimind to support this, and the Unimind agrees. And so what this does is it leads to Druig visiting Uranos in the exclusion. Now, Uranos is one of the original Eternals. When the Eternals were initially created, right, which is to say, like, they were initially formed by the Celestials, Uranos was one of the first, and he is one of the most powerful of the Eternals. Now, initially, it was believed that he was dead, and in fact, he was kind of killed to a degree. Instead of him being resurrected, he was kind of sort of a patchwork clone. But the reality is, again, using the kind of familiar relations, he is by all standards of measurement the grandfather of Thanos, right? Like literally that's who he is. He's that powerful. He's on that level of scale. And it's one of these cool things where Druig says, okay, if we are going to launch an attack against the mutant population, you are arguably the most powerful of us. So we are going to give you a task. He says, you have an hour, 1 hour. The machine has coded you to return here instantly, right? Because remember, the whole idea behind Uranos is, and the reason why he's locked up is that during the early days when the Eternals were initially created, Uranos thought that the best way for the Eternals to maintain their role was to literally eliminate all humans and all deviants, and then just conquer the world, and then spread out from there. That led to a civil war among the Eternals, and he was effectively killed, for lack of a better word, but then cloned and brought back. So he's not a truly resurrected Eternal. And so that's why he's a prisoner here, because the ongoing fear among the Eternals is that if he is released, he would incite another civil war among the Eternals, or perhaps just simply try to kill them all and then refuse to resurrect them, because he who is the Prime Eternal is the one that controls the machine, and he who controls the machine decides who gets resurrected. And so what Uranos says in one of the most amazing statements ever, he says, my own people have forgotten me. These mutants made Mars habitable in a day, but to destroy is always easier. A human takes 9 months to make another breathe. A human can crush a windpipe in seconds. You will see what Uranos the Undying can do with an hour. And so he basically goes forward on his mission, and we'll find out what that is. What this does is it switches over to Druig as part of the Damocles Foundation. Now, the Damocles Foundation was founded way back in the day. Its mission has basically changed now that Druig is the head. He's like the Prime Eternal. But initially, the basis behind the Damocles Foundation is that it was a coming together of humans and deviants and Eternals who believed that this kind of constant war that was going on between humans or between the Eternals and the deviants and whatnot would lead to the ruin of all. And so their goal was to actually find some kind of a peaceful resolution to this sort of warring nature of their differing societies, and then try to see that come to fruition. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. They've usually operated behind the scenes, but they've never really seen their goal come to fruition. But what ends up happening here is you actually have Druig, who's meeting with Moira McTaggart, and really she's allying with him with the idea of finding a way to eliminate the entirety of the mutant population. Because remember, Moira McTaggart was the one who started Krakoa in the first place, and unbeknownst to Xavier and Magneto, when they allied with her to create Krakoa, to create this mutant utopia, that what Moira McTaggart actually wanted to do was slowly eliminate the mutant gene so there would be no mutants. Because in every life that she lived, right, her power was to basically die and then to come back to life in essentially a new reality, right, kind of a restarting of the universe, so to speak, that in every single future that she saw, mutants were always killed. Mutants were always destroyed by the forces that they were going against, right? Humans, post-humans, you know, whatever the case happened to be. So her idea was to essentially slowly phase out the X gene, remove it entirely, and save the lives of mutants by getting rid of mutants completely. And so when that was brought to fruition, she was stripped of her powers using the gun of Forge, right, which basically nullifies abilities, and she was kicked out of Krakoa. And so as a result of this, she kind of harbors this vendetta where, one, she has a kind of personal grudge to want to see Krakoa fail, but two, she's steadfast in her mission. And so as a result of this, what ends up happening is a kind of agreement that's struck where it's like, I will do what I can to work with you. Because right now, Moira McTaggart is allied with Orchis, right? For those of you guys who aren't following the X-Men comic, Orchis is just this organization that exists out there that is a combination of like Hydra and Advanced Idea Mechanics and like former S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and things like that, who are all working to bring down the X-Men. And so her allying with the Eternals basically provides the Eternals with the resources of Orchis, because for the moment, their goals are aligned. And so what you end up having is Druig revealing that what the Eternals are doing is launching a three-pronged attack, which is genius in terms of how this unfolds. And that's what happens when you face off against the Eternals. They've been around for 1,000,000 years. They've watched wars, they've fought wars, they've observed them, they've seen how things go on, right? They see how to win in a conflict. The military strategy of Captain America is nothing in comparison to the strategy of the Eternals, because they've just been around for so long. And so what ends up happening is the first prong of this attack is the Unimind of the Eternals, at least those who are still under the control, or at least under the leadership of Druig, the Prime Eternal. That Unimind launches a telepathic attack against the Quiet Council and those telepaths who exist on Krakoa, right? Charles Xavier, Jean Grey, those guys, right? That kind of unified front. With that telepathic attack happening, right? Exodus and all those guys, with that telepathic attack happening, what it does is it keeps them distracted. It keeps them focused on that attack, on that conflict. While that conflict is happening, basically foot soldiers are sent in, right? And these foot soldiers offer another distraction for the other guys, Wolverine and Laura Kinney and Cyclops and Magic and all those guys, right? And because of the power of these forces, everybody literally runs to Krakoa, right? Like all the X-Men and everybody, they bail out on Arakko, they run to Krakoa, and they fight the battle there. Now, while that's going on, two other things go on. So I guess it's more of a four-pronged attack. Two other things happen. The next phase of the attack is for Druig to actually send in Jack of Knives. When Druig sends Jack of Knives in, because Jack of Knives is an Eternal that can render themselves invisible, that what it does is it allows Jack to get in there and start killing the Five, right? Remember, the Five are the ones who resurrect mutants. And so this is just ridiculously awesome. By targeting the Five, it destroys the ability for mutants to be resurrected, or at least that seems to be the case. Now, in order for that to happen, in order for resurrection to be in it entirely, all of the mutants have to, like all members of the Five, have to be killed. The problem is that Wolverine catches up to Jack of Knives. Now, under normal circumstances, Jack of Knives would be undetectable to Wolverine. Jack of Knives can mask their scent to the point that Wolverine can't pick it up. But what Wolverine does pick up is the blood on the dagger that Jack of Knives was using, which is a genius strat. It's just a genius piece of writing here. And so basically, it allows Wolverine to essentially stop Jack of Knives from killing all the members of the Five. And so this is when you get to the final phase of the attack, as it's outlined by Druig, right? The Jack of Knives did technically fail, and where Moira McTaggart is like, you had your one chance to destroy the ability for mutants to resurrect themselves, the response of Druig is patience, right? You are looking at things in the short term because you haven't lived as long as I have. It's all about patience, right? At the very least, we will have eroded their numbers. And when the question's asked by Moira McTaggart, well, what about all the mutants, the 1 million mutants that exist on Arakko, right? What about all of them? The response of Druig is, they're not our concern, because what you end up finding out is that the task of Uranos was to go to Arakko, to go to Mars, and kill every single mutant there. And he's seemingly done exactly that. Cable, Magneto, all those guys, Storm, he eradicated them all. That's the power of Uranos. That's how powerful that guy is. He killed them all, seemingly on his own. And so he's immediately teleported back as soon as that hour is over. Druig teleports back to the capital city, right, to the exclusion zone in the capital city of the Eternals. And that's when he's told by Uranos, you're gonna need me again, right? You have to let me out. You're gonna need me. And the response to Druig is, if that time comes, then we will let you out. But until then, that's not going to happen. And so in the face of all of this, right, with this attack launched on the X-Men, the entirety of the mutant population on Krakoa just in disorganized disarray, right? The mutants on Arakko, those individuals who can be resurrected, have been resurrected, right? Basically, the mutants just kind of left in a state of panic and chaos, having no real idea on what's going on. The response of Druig is to actually tap into the world's electronic systems and broadcast live simultaneously to every human around the world. And what he says is this. He says, people of Earth, I am Druig of the Eternals. I am speaking to you via your extremely impressive high-tech devices. And that's when, like, Captain America realizes everybody's getting this message. Even the Avengers are watching this message. And Druig says, I could use telepathy, but we consider that intrusive and crass. It's a nouveau immortal move. And yes, I'm talking about these mutants. They're a threat to you all. They have overstepped their natural bounds and clearly aim for a dominion that stretches across worlds and eternity. We apologize that we've let them go so far, but rest assured, we serve you, as we have for 1,000,000 years. And humanity is championing this. Humanity is celebrating this, right? Basically the Eternals stepping up and saying, we will eliminate the mutant threat for you. But Druig says, however, we must ask you to not be afraid of the towering death machines that have emerged off the western seaboard of the United States. They are not towering death machines, they are the Hex, and they are Eternals. Yes, we're not all human-sized, but rest assured, whether large or small, we are your protectors. That said, we would advise anyone in any coastal regions to head inland as swiftly as they can. It's possible this may get messy. Now, this is one of the things that's been going on with the Eternals comics. Those guys who haven't really been watching our videos on it, the entire basis behind Kieran Gillen's run with the Eternals is to expand them drastically. It's an entire society, and it's way more than the Eternals that we were initially introduced to in Marvel Comics. There's so much more to them than that. They come in all shapes and sizes, all forms. It's wild how this is going down. It's really, really cool. And so in response to all of this, Captain America assembles the Avengers. And so what happens is that while the Avengers are being assembled and trying to find some way to respond to what the Eternals are doing, Iron Man picks up on basically an intrusion alarm. And when he gets there, he basically finds Ajax and he finds Makari. Now, the funny thing about this is that they're basically getting in the same way that like they had gotten in before, which Iron Man kind of takes as a little bit of an insult, but they've also got Sinister in tow, which explains why Sinister had basically vanished from the X-Men's Quiet Council, where it is that he's been all this time. He's being held captive by the Eternals. And the idea here, the goal of the Eternals, at least those who have broken away from Druig, who don't really operate under the Eternal main society, right? So think of them as like the American separatists that broke away from England and like founded what became the United States. That's kind of what the Eternals are to a degree. But the thing about this is their job is to say, okay, look, this is a holy war, right? Like what Druig is doing is he is building he's building his actions based on the godly decree, right? The holy decree of the Celestials, which is we as Eternals correct excess deviation. He's using that as a reason to wipe out the X-Men. So if it is gods who established this, then it is gods who can correct this. We need the Celestials to make this happen. And we need a god as a Celestial that can do this for us, right? That can establish a new law. And when the question is asked by Iron Man, okay, I mean, this is interesting, but where the hell are you going to make a god in a few hours? The response of Makari and Ajax is, look around you, man. We're literally inside of a dead Celestial. It can't be that impossible to resurrect him. And the reality is that it's not. Remember, back in 2008, during Charles Knopf's run, which is at least one of the Eternals runs that we have. So we'll create a playlist for Judgment Day so it all kind of comes together and makes sense, that the Eternals do have an afterlife. They visit the Fulcrum once they basically quote unquote die, right? The Fulcrum being an aspect of the one above all. They do have like a kind of afterlife. You can recall a dead Celestial. You can bring them back. Now, whether or not that happens is something that we'll see over the course of this story. But I gotta say, man, Judgment Day hits with a bang. I'm trying to figure out if we should do this like just over the course of the week and then like every other day, just do like a second video. Or if we do this as like a weekly thing, right? Because the weekly thing it makes it so exciting, just kind of anticipate it. But I had to cover this story, right? So here's the thing. This story focuses on Exodus. And those are the guys who have been following the X-Men mythos as we've done it so far, right? Jonathan Hickman's run, going into Jerry Dugan's run and all that kind of stuff. You've seen Exodus just kind of lingering around, but you've never really seen him fight. And in fact, you never really got a whole lot of insight in the mind of Exodus, which kind of sucks because Exodus has been around for a long, long time, right? So Exodus, he originally appeared way back in 1993 with X Factor issue number 92. And in fact, he became a part of Magneto's acolytes when he was quote unquote woken up by Magneto in X-Force issue number 25, which I'm pretty sure was released that same year. But what's really funny about his character though, is that despite being introduced in the early 90s, we didn't get an origin for him until Black Knight, the one-shot story that was told in 1996 that it picked up off of a Defenders story, which basically saw that Dane Whitman, the Black Knight, and Cersei of the Eternals were basically time displaced and they ended up in the 12th century. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But what this initially does is it basically picks up on kind of the origin of Exodus, of Bennett Duperry. Now, this is a smart decision to make by Kieran Gillen. It's a genius decision because Exodus is a character people are now aware of, but only because of his time on the Quiet Council and everything going on with Jonathan Hickman's run up until now. But he's a character people don't know the story of. And a lot of people don't know just how ridiculously overpowered this guy is. It's crazy how powerful he is. So the thing about this is that Bennett Duperry initially rose to prominence during the Crusade. This initially opens up when he's actually out in the desert and he encounters the Phoenix Force. Now, it doesn't possess him, but he simply just meets him. And it's one of those things where it was the first time that he actually encountered anything that could really be referred to as a god, despite the fact that he was fighting in the Crusades. Up until that point, it was just some disembodied being that exists out there in the ether, right? Whose word he follows. And like, that was it. That was really all there was. But seeing the Phoenix Force physically manifest actually instilled in him a faith, but it was actually a faith predicated on mutants. Now, the thing about this this is he didn't know he was a mutant at the time. And we'll talk about how we reconcile that here in a second. But what it does here is it jumps back to Krakoa, and it basically picks up with everything that he's talking about, and really just the Quiet Council themselves, who were talking about how a war with the Eternals are coming, right? So this takes place slightly before the events of Judgment Day #1 proper. But it's one of those things where they're kind of like, you know, how do we come to terms with this, right? One, Nathaniel Essex, right? Like Mr. Sinister, he's been kidnapped, and we don't know exactly how to cope with this. Like, if he's been taken by the Eternals, they've literally started a conflict by basically kidnapping one of our own. How do we respond in kind without instigating a full-scale war? Now, on one side, you have what are basically the more level-headed people, right? So Emma Frost to a degree, Charles Xavier, so on and so forth. On the other side, you have the Warhawks like Sebastian Shaw, who were like, no, we can't operate on the defense, it's offense. We have to go and get him, and then if a war starts, whatever, let the chips fall where they may, right? We are the mutant population. There are more of us than there are those Eternals. We can take them on. But the reality here is that Sebastian Shaw painfully misunderstands just how many Eternals there are and what form those Eternals take. And that's one of the things that's really being hit on here during the Judgment Day story, is that the Eternals are not simply just the people that we've seen Marvel publish stories about over the course of the last however many decades, and like that's it. That the Eternals are huge in number, and there's a variety of them all over the world that we simply just didn't know about, which is kind of interesting because in a lot of ways, the Judgment Day event and the whole revelation of the Eternals in Marvel Comics is very much following the Inhumanity storyline. And I'm sure a lot of you guys who are aware of Inhumanity coming out of the storyline that came out of like Infinity, right? That story itself, which basically dealt with Black Bolt detonating the Terrigen bomb, spreading the Terrigen mist across the world, and then all these people who were Inhumans and didn't know it, suddenly just waking up to become Inhumans, right? Just going through Terrigenesis, so like, you know, Kamala Khan and like all those different characters. It very much feels that way to a degree, except it's really more that we're discovering the fact that they've always been here, as opposed to the fact that like they're just now coming into existence. But one of the things that happens here, and Xavier is really kind of the top guy in the Quiet Council, albeit unofficially, they are all technically equal in power, but because of Xavier's history with the X-Men, he's kind of like the #1 guy. Sort of everybody just kind of silently agrees on that he really looks at it from the perspective of saying, okay, like the reality here is that the Eternals, they hold no grudge that we know of. We expected Orcus, we are not prepared for war against them. But from Exodus's perspective, he's just kind of hitting on this, and he's like, Sinister's gone. This is suspicious for dozens of reasons. We should purge him from the Quiet Council. And it's one of those things where as he thinks and as he analyzes, he looks over at Destiny and he sees that Destiny has a kind of small twitch in her chair, which is enough for him to realize him just having these thoughts could potentially have a massive impact on the future. Now remember, it's very difficult for Destiny to predict what's going to happen based on what somebody's thinking or things that are supposed to happen in the far-flung future. She's very, very good at predicting on the battlefield. It's one of the reasons why when she was part of Mystique's Brotherhood, she was instrumental in their ability to defeat the X-Men, because literally they would be in the heat of combat and she would be like, Gambit's coming from that direction, and like they would be able to overpower Gambit before he even got there. It was just one of those things, right? I might go back and cover those older X-Men stories because there's just so many callbacks in this run and it makes me really nostalgic for it. But what he ends up doing is actually talking about how Destiny currently sits in the chair of Apocalypse and Apocalypse is gone. And then he has a flashback to his own history and says Apocalypse is here, but here is not now. And it's one of those things where he's literally jumping to his own origin story. Now, this is one of the things to explain here, right? Because what you end up having is this situation where you basically end up having Cersei and Eobard Garrington, who essentially meet with Exodus after he becomes Exodus. So to fill in these gaps here, which are not readily explained by Kieran Gillen, and to actually give you the origin of Exodus, the way this played out is that as part of the Crusades, that Exodus and, or I guess Bennett Duperry, which is what he's initially known as, and Eobard Garrington are basically trying to find what's called the Tower of Power. Now, the Tower of Power itself, at least as it was explained in the old Black Knight Exodus story, it's not really a tower of power in a literal sense. It's the home of the eternal pharaoh. Now, what they don't know is that it's actually the home of Apocalypse. They really don't know what they're getting into here. But the way this story played out is that it was actually picking up off the heels of an existing Defender story where the Black Knight Dane Whitman and Cersei were effectively time displaced. And so what it did is it led to them arriving in the 12th century. When that happened, the mind or spirit or whatever you want to call it of Dane Whitman entered the body of Eobard Garrington, who is basically his ancestor, right? He's one of the older Black Knights that existed in Marvel Comics before Dane Whitman became the Black Knight. And so what that did is it led to Dane just kind of occupying the body, but not actually having control, that Eobard himself had control. And so that's why if you go back and you read that story, that something seems a little off about Eobard Garrington when things first pick up, and he talks about how like he had seen a woman and like the whole thing feels like a dream to him, but he eventually encounters Cersei. And when that happens, he abandons the quest with Bennett Duperry, who continues on his own. And so ultimately he ends up coming across Apocalypse, and Apocalypse puts him through these kind of trials, which even now are not readily explained in this particular comic, at least even in just this one, the Immortal X-Men tie-in for Judgment Day. But the important thing here is the trials were done in the manner by which Apocalypse normally conducts trials, which is to say it was testing the mind, body, and spirit of Exodus to determine whether or not he was even worthy of any enhancements Apocalypse could give him. Ultimately, Bennett was proved worthy, and in doing so, Apocalypse realized that Bennett Duperry was a mutant. He activated his X gene and then amplified his powers. And what it did is it pushed Exodus to becoming an Omega level telepath and telekinetic. The guy's wildly powerful. I mean, this guy has an advanced, like an accelerated healing factor. It's not really on the same level as Wolverine, but it's an exceedingly capable healing factor. The guy's got enhanced longevity. His telekinesis is so fine-tuned that he can actually alter the molecular structure of matter. Now, Marvel's never moved that past just surface use, right? They've never moved it into the realm of him being able to like alter matter on a universal scale. Arguably he could, Marvel just doesn't really do it. So think of it more as like a soft cap on his powers. They just haven't really explored that part of his character yet. But even beyond that, the guy's telepathy is on the same level as Jean Grey, Professor Xavier, those guys. He can teleport to virtually any distance, anywhere. It doesn't really matter where it is. The guy's ridiculously capable, but having those powers augmented and having his abilities amplified also added a caveat. And the reason why is because in this story, and this one that we're covering here, as well as in the old Black Knight Exodus stories, that what happened is that as a testing, initially Apocalypse instructed Cersei and Eobard to kill Exodus, which they refused to do. He then instructed Exodus to kill them, which he refused to do. And in fact, he turned on Apocalypse and actually ended up fighting Apocalypse and trying to overpower him, right? Because again, Exodus being a guy who very much follows religious convictions, comes to the realization that Apocalypse is, by all standards of measurement, a false god. And in fact, he declares him that Apocalypse is not the god that he purports himself to be. He's just a really powerful guy. And so when Exodus turns on Apocalypse, Apocalypse overpowers him and then locks him away. Now, the biggest issue that you had to contend with when it came to that is in later stories, Exodus just demonstrated levels of power that were so high that it left people asking, how in the hell could Apocalypse beat this guy? And so what Marvel did is they added in the caveat that his powers are tied to his confidence. If he's surrounded by the right kind of people, or if he has full confidence in himself, that Exodus's powers reach their total peak. And this guy is an absolute monster when he's operating at his peak. But even when he just believes in himself, his power is more than enough to rival Apocalypse and really even overcome Apocalypse. And that's how Marvel fixed that, is by saying that at the time when he initially fought Apocalypse, he wasn't entirely certain of what he was capable of. There was a little fear when it came to Apocalypse, and he didn't have the highest amount of confidence in himself. And that's how Insaba Nur was able to defeat him. And so following that, he was effectively locked away. Now, one of the things that this does is it jumps back to the modern era, right? Following this kind of flashback, it jumps back to the modern events when the Eternals launched the attack of the Unimind, right? Like literally uniting their minds together and launching a telepathic attack against Krakoa and the Quiet Council. And so as that happens, of course, the telepaths themselves are able to fend off the attack. But the funny thing here is that where Xavier and everybody else is basically struggling to hold their own, Bennett's doing it with the greatest of ease. He's able to hold it. He's able to just hold it off, right? And it's just kind of like, yep, I mean, it's a thing that I'm dealing with, because while he's dealing with the Unimind, he's flashing back on his own memories, which if anything, this is a testament to how powerful he is. But then following that, he kind of touches back on his own history and talks about how he had slept for hundreds of years and then was ultimately woken up by what he thought was another, not really a mutant god, but a kind of messiah. He was woken up by Magneto. Now again, this is in the old X-Force comics, X-Force number 25, and this is when Magneto arrives and purports himself as a messiah, because this was old school Magneto, or really kind of new old school Magneto. This is during the X-Men Volume 2 era. And that in effect what had happened is that when Magneto woke up Exodus, that Exodus ended ended up joining his acolytes. Now, the acolytes of Magneto were amazing back in the day, Fabian Cortez and all those guys, but basically they were like people who were just religiously devoted to Magneto. They saw him as a god in a lot of ways, right? The Messiah who was going to bring about the positive change that they had been looking for, which was to basically eliminate humanity in terms of its hatred of mutants, and to either lead mutants into a better place, which in this instance was basically Avalon, or it was to eradicate the mutant population in its entirety so the mutants could live on Earth without fear of humans hunting them. But the thing about this is that Bene Gesserit came to the realization quite quickly that basically Magneto was not really a messiah or anything like that. If anything, he was kind of a prophet, but much like Apocalypse, he was just a mutant who was out there who was purporting this idea that he could lead people into a better future. And so ultimately Exodus became disillusioned and ended up walking away. Now, of course, jumping back to the current events again, this leads to Wolverine showing up and saying like there's some kind of silent Eternal running around here and is killing off the various members of the Five. Now, we saw that during the Judgment Day story, if you guys recall, that you literally had that Eternal who was killing the members of the Five, and that Magneto was able to stop her before they could go on like eradicating everybody. Because once the Five are gone, there's no way to resurrect anybody anymore, right? Because the Five are the means by which people are resurrected. So there's no way to resurrect them. So that's why they're really kept in the hatchery. They're kept exceedingly well protected by the mutants. In fact, they're protected more than Xavier and Magneto are, right? They're like the entirety of Krakoa lives and dies by the members of the Five. They almost caught Hope Summers and so on and so forth. And so it's a really, really cool thing, because what Exodus does is, in listening to all of this, like Emma Frost talking and all these guys, he's like, I need to interpret the situation in a way that I understand. And so he's like, I am a knight, right? And I am in the desert. And this force is not the Eternals that I'm facing off against. It's just a dragon, right? I'm interpreting it in a way that just makes the most sense to me. And so literally it's one of those things where he kind of mulls over this whole situation, and then he starts thinking about Hope Summers. And that's when he comes to this realization, or really just kind of gives us this realization that he had, that for the very first time in the history of his life, he encountered what he actually thought was a true Messiah, and the person he views as an actual Messiah. And it's the reason why Exodus has such a reverence towards Hope Summers on the island of Krakoa. You've probably noticed it as you've been reading the different X-Men comics. We haven't heavily focused on it because, in all honesty, I didn't know if they were ever going to really explore it at all, but they are here, right? Kieran Gillen is focusing on it here. And the reason for this, and Exodus even says that, is he says, when the Scarlet Witch, he refers to her as the Red Witch, but he says, when the Scarlet Witch altered reality during House of M and then set everything back, and in doing so, took away 98% of the mutant population's powers, reduced the population down to about 198 mutants, that he was one of the only mutants that retained his abilities. Now, different fan bases have argued different things based on the power of Exodus, that Exodus was so incredibly powerful that he subconsciously used his own powers to actually override the influence of the Scarlet Witch so he could maintain his own abilities. Again, that's just total fan speculation. There's never been anything in the comics to indicate that was the case, although it'd be amazing if it were true. But regardless, he looks at this whole thing and says, like, for a time, there were so few of us left. I thought we were on the brink of destruction. I thought our extinction was imminent. But the truth is that in the main Marvel universe, following the events of House of M, decimation and all that kind of stuff, that's when you basically started coming into Hope Summers. When Hope Summers popped up on the scene, you eventually got the 12 Lights storyline. And the 12 Lights storyline was basically Hope Summers becoming the Messiah, and the fact that her birth solidified the return of the mutant population to the main Marvel universe. Mutants started being born at a higher rate, right? They were literally coming back. And so that's why Exodus sees Hope Summers as a true mutant Messiah, and he takes it as a personal mission in saying, because the Eternals had launched an attack against Hope, and because they almost killed Hope, that now they have basically attacked what he views as being his God, right? His Messiah, the Messiah of the mutant population. And so in response, it's one of these amazing things, because while they are able to overcome the Unimind, this leads to the secondary attack of the Eternals, which we talked about at the end of Judgment Day, when you basically have these just enormous Eternals who aren't really machines. They are actually eternal beings that basically start attacking Krakoa. And these things are massive and powerful. We don't know exactly how powerful, but we know they're exceedingly powerful. And it's one of these amazing moments where, like, Exodus just has this insane monologue. He tells Hope Summers, right? When Hope Summers says, we're not ready for this, right? We're not ready for those guys. That's a level of power that we as mutants are not ready for. The response of Exodus is, we are, and I am, right? He says, return to safety and return the fallen warriors to the field. Be an inspiration. Guard the flame of mutant life. Be yourself. It is more than sufficient. And when she says, what are you going to do? His response is, they're dragon's hope. What do you think I'm going to do? And he says, I am the Pope of a new church, like Peter was long ago. He says Peter was the rock upon which the Nazarene mutant built his church. And he says, yes, I am that rock, but I am also the rock in the hand of Cain. I can build or I can destroy, and no one out there can do it on the level that I can. So we actually get a countdown here. Now, one thing to know, everything that you're gonna see in this comic takes place over the span of 1 hour. So what this does is this initially picks up on the planet of Arakko, right? The Great Ring. Now, one thing to remember, the Great Ring is Arakko's version of the Quiet Council from Krakoa. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, the Quiet Council on Krakoa is basically the governing body of pretty much all the Earthbound mutants that we're aware of. When you had like the whole Ten of Swords event and Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, and you ended up learning that there was like a whole other dimension that had all these mutants that were in it, instead of them residing on Earth with the regular X-Men in Krakoa, they basically took off to Mars. That Arakko, the Great Ring, is their governing body. That one of the things to know is that the Great Ring is composed exclusively of Omega level mutants. There are no mutants on here that are not Omega level in power. That's why you have Iska the Unbeaten. That's why you have Cable, Magneto, different people like that. And then you actually have mutants that are from Arakko. So Aura Serrata, Ludos Logos, people like that, who's actually going to be really important as we get further into the story. But one of the things that happens here is Abigail Brand shows up literally with 1 minute left and basically tells them like, okay, there's a war breaking out between the Eternals, the Avengers, and the X-Men. Just so you guys know, we need to have some kind of involvement in this, right? We need to send our forces to Earth in order to ally with the Krakoan mutants to basically defeat the Eternals, because the Eternals are so astronomically powerful, and then defend off against the X-Men. Now, one of the things to know is that Abigail Brand's presence here is not really welcome. Technically speaking, she is the director of SWORD, the Sentient World Observation and Response Department, but much like Nick Fury when it comes to S.H.I.E.L.D., she's kind of shady. And the thing about this is that she actually wanted to install spies in Arakko that would basically feed her information, which basically became public knowledge. But the thing about this is that as she's basically communicating this message, and as she's saying that, one of the things that happens is you basically get this prophecy, right? Now, what had happened here somewhere along the line is you had what was called Idle the Seer, right? She's basically Arakko's version of Destiny from the X-Men comics on Krakoa. She can see the future, and she's an Omega level mutant. The difference here is that she at some point lost her tongue, and so she can't actually speak what it is that she sees. They kind of rely on her silence, right? The kind of silent messages she conveys in order to interpret things. And so what had happened is she had basically revealed a prophecy, right? She says, an empty heart beats hardest, an empty hand deals the impossible blow, and the stalemate ends with victory's loss. That prophecy is probably going to become incredibly important later on down the line. It will become important for this segment here, but that may end up playing like a major role over the course of the story. But again, these guys don't know that they're on a timetable, right? 1 minute, 49 seconds, 48 seconds, 30 seconds, right? The clock is counting down. And it's one of those things where they're just kind of having this conversation like, okay, well, I mean, who in the world are we going to send? You know, and it's just, for them, it's just kind of general business for the Great Circle. But then suddenly a blue light emanates out of nowhere. And they're like, what in the hell is that? And that's when you get the arrival of Uranos. Now, one of the things that happens here is they say, okay, the war has reached our doorsteps. What's the chance that we have of winning? And Iska turns on them and then kills one of the members of the Great Circle. Now, one of the things to remember, Iska the Unbeaten can never lose. Her mutant power is that whatever she does will basically guarantee her victory, or guarantee the victory of the side she's on. Now, it can be manipulated. That's what we saw when we had that tournament that was going on before, when you had that fight taking place between Scar and you had Magneto. So like, it can be manipulated, it can be tricked. In this instance though, what she's doing is designed to illustrate that they're all gonna die, right? They're all basically going to fall. Now, the only person who really looks at the situation and comes to the realization that the only way to truly win is to defeat Iska, right? To basically kill Iska, the Nightcrawler teleports over and then takes her off the board with the intention of basically taking her out. But when that happens, once he teleports away with Iska, then you've got the arrival of Uranos, right? right? The grandfather of Thanos. Now, here's the thing that I want to make this perfectly clear. When it comes to Uranos, he's one of the OG Eternals, the original Eternals, old school, right? Depending on how Marvel does this, it could very well be that Uranos is more powerful than Thanos. But he literally says, like mutants, you have excess, like you are excessively deviating, and I have 1 hour to correct you. Because remember, mutants are basically the result of the deviant gene entering the human bloodstream. It's one of the great big huge changes that Marvel's making, which I absolutely love. I think it's one of the coolest things. But it's kind of nuts because within the span of 30 seconds, Uranos kills 11,000 mutants like that, right? In the span of 30 seconds. And the way in which he does this is that it's not simply just an attack on Arakko. One of the things that had happened here is that Druig, who's currently the Prime Eternal, when he released Uranos, he also released his weapons cache. And so what's happening here is that Earth and Mars are not the only places across the universe where mutants reside, that some of those mutants from Arakko actually left Mars and took off into the universe. They created settlements on other planets, different things like that. And so what you have is the forces of Uranos, albeit, you know, autonomous drones or what have you, who are showing up at these different locations and eradicating all these mutants in all these places. For example, in the skies above Port Prometheus, that's where these things show up, right? In these locations, all these different spots, right? The Valley of the Fallen and so on and so forth, different places across the universe. So in a lot of ways, it is quite literally a universe-wide conflict. Now, one of the crazy things that goes on is that 6 minutes into this, right? This is 6 minutes in, that what you have here is Aura Serrata that uses her eye on Uranos. Now, one of the things to remember is that Aura Serrata is an Omega level mutant that when she looks at something, they basically cease to exist. She's essentially an ultimate nullifier, right? Literally, it's as if they never existed in the first place. It doesn't work on Uranos. It has no effect on him whatsoever. And so for whatever reason that's not explained here, this guy survives the entire experience and then takes Aura out. Following that, one of the things that happens, and this is a crazy moment, which I hope we actually get to see later on down the line, Legion shows up. Now, Legion showing up here, here's the thing to remember. When you're facing off against Legion, you're not just fighting one Omega level mutant, you're fighting a legion of Omega level mutants, right? You're just fighting as many powers as he has. Because remember, Legion has all kinds of personalities. There's Susan and Sunshine, there's the Origamist, there's all kinds of people there, right? There's all kinds of abilities that can manipulate people in differing ways when these different personalities take over. Legion himself, just David Haller on his own, is an Omega level telepath and telekinetic. He's wildly powerful. The downside to this is that we basically end up seeing Uranos take off with Legion, the two of them fight, and then Uranos comes back. Literally the next page, we don't actually see what happens between the two of them in this conflict, but nonetheless, this is when you get to see like the full-on power of Magneto and like one of the greatest moments in the history of Magneto. So one of the things that goes on here, right? God, this is ridiculously amazing. One of the things that happens here, right? While you have literally these forces that are going through, right? These forces of Uranos that are attacking in all these different locations, you have the forces of Arakko that are fending off as best they can, and then you actually have Richard Rider Nova, who's actually helping to defend the Arakko mutants to the best of his ability, but ultimately he just can't seem to pull it off, right? He just doesn't have the power to do it on his own. I mean, he can hold off, but in the end, like, ultimately these mutants are going to fall. But one of the things that happens is that Magneto enlists Lotus Logos. Now, this guy is ridiculously cool. This guy can manipulate any form of metal in existence. And in fact, he can actually produce metal from his own physical body, which in doing so, Magneto just enlists that ability from him, right? Like this guy's feeding Magneto metal and Magneto is using it on Uranos and literally just like puncturing this guy, trying to encase this guy, the whole 9 yards, literally wraps him in metal shards, keeping this guy held in place. And Uranos breaks out of it anyway, right? Like this is 13 minutes in. These guys are falling like flies. And in fact, Uranos walks up on Magneto and just punches a hole in his chest and kills Magneto on the spot. And so one of the things that happens is that Cable tells his computer, right? He says body slide by 0, weapon cache Omega 1. It's this weapon that he has, this giant gun, right? The Omega 1 pulse rifle that is the most powerful gun in Cable's arsenal. Now, one of the things to remember is this has to be provided in context because on its own, it's just a giant gun that Cable has. Rahu, why is that special? Because one of the things to remember is that Cable comes from a time when Apocalypse rules the world. So this weapon was designed for the purpose and could have completely eradicated Apocalypse. Cable uses this and he fires it on Uranos and nothing happens, right? He keeps firing it to the point that it overheats and it doesn't affect Uranos at all. That's the power of Uranos, right? The fact that this weapon, which could just annihilate someone like Apocalypse who uses celestial technology, that it has no effect on this guy whatsoever. And the falls keep coming, right? Like the deaths just keep happening. That Uranos just keeps killing every single mutant he comes across, annihilates all of them. He takes out Abigail Brand. Now, here's the crazy thing. While all of this is happening, Fisher King is just observing, right? He's literally just in his home and he's aware of it taking place. Now remember, he's a baseline human, but the big on-running theory here is that Fisher King was not introduced for no reason. He was not introduced for no purpose at all. That in fact, in the face of all of this, right, the eradication of all these mutants that are dying across the entirety of Arakko, that Fisher King is going to basically activate a subset, kind of like a fail-safe protocol for a handful of mutants that we simply just didn't know about. It's one of the things that people are speculating of is going to be a kind of like super secret inner circle, so kind of like a Black Ops team, which I'm excited to see if that's going to be the case. But one thing that I want to hit at here, Uranos had 1 hour to eradicate as many mutants as he possibly could on Arakko, to eradicate all of them, which includes a council full of Omega level mutants. He did it in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. He killed them all, every single one of them. Now, here's the crazy thing. We get this like amazing monologue, right? We're basically told that Uranos uses the remaining time well, right? T-minus 60 minutes, right? The hour is over. And it says, so is 98% of all life in a 50-mile radius. All these guys are basically dead, right? Uranos leaves satisfied. He is supremely confident in his ability to bring death. In all the ages, he has never felt the need to check his work. In this, he is foolish. He has spent the last hour on the planet Arakko, and on Arakko, you always make sure. And so one of the things that happens is we actually end up finding out that Lotus Logos had basically survived. Now, it wasn't just him, and in fact, he's told by some disembodied voice, forgive me, right? Like, I had to hide you. I had to hide you and keep you protected because you're the person that I have to keep alive in order to help me. And so in response to this, Lotus says, he challenged all of us. We cannot yield nor die too quickly. This way I fight again and take revenge for the bones that are all laid here. For all the people that Uranos killed, I'm going to get revenge. And the response here is no, right? Do not do that. At the moment, we have to be alive. We have to marshal our forces. We have to find a way to strike back. If we do that now, we will all perish. We have to unify and we have to bring an end to all of this. Because literally Logos is just like, okay, so Aura Serrata is maimed only, right? Her eye is injured. In time, she can be healed and her power can be restored. And he says she has survived much worse, but her weapon will require healing. And Uranos's weapons will roam unchecked. We must strategize. And the response here is no, right? Such strategies are not the place for you, right? You are not the one running the show here anymore. In the end, I am the one who sits at the seat of loss, and the seat of loss now seizes control because this is a war and it's a war that we are losing. So if we are going to win, we have to follow a strategy that I have devised. Literally, Magneto survived having his heart ripped out. Now, this is the power of Magneto as an Omega level mutant. This guy, what it looks like he's doing here, because we're not given a definitive explanation, this guy literally looks like he's controlling the iron in his blood to keep his blood flowing, to keep his blood pumping so his body can function. Because remember, once the heart's gone, there's nothing to pump blood throughout the body. And so literally your organs, your brain, they don't get the blood you need, and then you ultimately die. But by Magneto manipulating the iron in his blood and keeping his blood flowing, he keeps himself alive. That's the power of this guy. This dude has no heart in his chest. It's been ripped out of his body and he's keeping himself going. Not only that, there's two things to take away from this. The first is that Magneto is a master strategist. I mean, you're talking about a guy who has at different points in time over the course of his publication history taken on any combination of the Inhumans, which don't really matter because the Inhumans suck, the Avengers, the other X-Men, and even Eternals, and has won. He's done it several times over. This guy is a monster. Not only that, he controls the entirety of the electromagnetic spectrum. What we saw here is a taste of the full power Magneto has, and the reason for that that is the second thing. Magneto is pissed. And you talk to anybody out there who knows anything about Magneto, and they will tell you, man, they will tell you, son, when Magneto gets pissed, oh, dude, when Magneto gets angry, that's when the war just begins. But what this does here is this picks up with the Eternals who have launched their attack against the X-Men. Now, we covered that in the last video, right? We covered the Eternals making their attack against the mutant nation of Krakoa. What the Eternals did not account for was the fact that Krakoa has some ridiculously powerful mutants here. Some of the most powerful beings that exist in the universe exist on this island, and one of them is Exodus, which of course we covered, and Exodus quite literally takes on one of these Eternals by himself. And it's kind of a crazy thing because when that happens, he takes this guy out with a quickness. I mean, it happens so fast. Exodus just destroys these guys, and that's to be expected because remember, Exodus is one of the most powerful beings to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics. The guy's ridiculously OP. But the other part of this is that you do have Eternals, all of whom have varying powers. We don't really get the specifics of this Eternal's power, the one that Exodus destroys, but there is one that's attacking the other part of the island that in fact Cyclops and those guys are dealing with, and that one has the ability to manipulate the fauna, manipulate basically the plant life and plant matter around the island, so much so that it actually starts using the island itself against the X-Men. Now, they are able to hold their own to a degree, but in the midst of all this, the X-Men are met by the arrival of the Avengers. Now, I know you guys are probably asking yourself, but if this is Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals, shouldn't the Avengers be fighting the X-Men? We'll talk about that here in a minute. But when the Avengers arrive on the scene, one of the things to know is that their arrival here is one part due to the fact that there's a massive calamity taking place, but the other part of this is because of the history between the Avengers and the X-Men. So for those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me here for a second. For those of you guys who don't know what this means, in Marvel Comics, there was a story that was called Avengers versus X-Men, and it was amazing because not only did you get to see the teams fight each other, Marvel actually released a series of one-shots that focused on the Avengers facing off against different members of the X-Men. So Captain America versus Gambit, different things like that. It was a really cool series. We might go back and remaster when they announced the X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But the thing about this is that the Avengers being here is because of the fact that they didn't initially want to fight the X-Men in the Avengers versus X-Men story. Things just transpired that way. And so because of that, there's a kind of a mixed reaction here. Exodus does not want them here. And Exodus is a member of the governing body of the X-Men. So his word goes a pretty long way. But in the end, while he is a member of the governing body of protecting Krakoa, it's not really left to Exodus and the Quiet Council to decide. It's left to the war chiefs. And at the end of the day, they're just like, the Avengers can join. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that while this battle is going on Krakoa, that you do have a subsect of the Eternals that had actually abandoned Druig, who's currently leading the Eternals themselves. And he's the one that's waging war against the X-Men and presumably the Avengers, or at least we'll see in the future of this story. And so because of that, you do have some of these Eternals who are actually working with Iron Man. They're working with Riri Williams, also known as Ironheart. They're working with them to actually revitalize Avengers Mountain. Now, here's one of the things to understand. Avengers Mountain is actually a giant celestial, and it has been since that story was introduced, since it was launched by Jason Aaron. It's known as the Progenitor Celestial. This is arguably the most powerful of all the Celestials, but the significance of the Progenitor is that it was here, or at least arrived on Earth, due to an attack it was already sustaining, and because it was basically dying from the inside out when it was being killed by the Horde, who were basically kind of like the arch nemesis of the Celestials. But what ended up happening is that when it arrived on Earth, quite literally its blood seeded life on the world. And that's how Marvel offers a modern day explanation of where life came from on Earth, that it's a result of the Progenitor Celestial. But the goal here of the Eternals and Iron Man and Riri Williams is to basically resurrect the Progenitor. Now, the thing about this, and what's really kind of a funny kicker here, is that you basically switch back to the Avengers and the X-Men facing off against each other. And one of the things to know is that the X-Men, ever since the launch of Krakoa, have had the ability to resurrect themselves. It's why it doesn't matter whenever an X-Man dies, depending on the situation, because the Quiet Council could decide not to bring them back, and there's no way for that X-Man or that mutant to return. But by and large, most all of them do. So even when you had it was actually the great uncle of Thanos, but even when you have the great uncle of Thanos who showed up on Mars, where you have basically another subsect of mutants residing and killed 15 million of them, at the end of the day, they can just resurrect them all. It's gonna take a while because there's 15 million of them, but they can still resurrect them. At that point, it just comes down to whether or not the mutants on Krakoa want to. But the thing behind this is that Captain America literally tells Cyclops, hey, we're definitely here to help, man, but I wish you'd told us before, with everything that we've gone through, I wish you told us before that you had the ability to basically resurrect yourself. And that's when Cyclops, like, think about what you just said, man. After everything we've been through, you guys waged war on us. Why would we tell you that we have the ability to resurrect ourselves? And that's one of those instances when Captain America's kind of like, okay, yeah, you kind of have a point. But basically, the X-Men and the Avengers team up to face off against the Eternals. Now, the cool thing about this is that, again, the Eternals launching their attack is happening in multiple stages. They're attacking the mutant nation of Krakoa. That's where these gigantic Eternals called the Hex, that's where they're focusing most of their attack. But one of the things to remember is that Namor the Submariner is a mutant. And as a result of that, one of the Eternals, one of the members of the Hex, has gone to Atlantis. Now, that member of the Hex has basically been dealt with by a combination of the X-Men and Namor the Submariner, who are basically able to destroy it. The problem with this is that with this destruction basically comes essentially an explosion underwater. And as you can imagine, if something that massive, right, is basically as big as Galactus or a Celestial, if it were to just explode in the ocean, it's going to create tidal waves, it's going to create tsunamis, earthquakes, all different kinds of things. And what this does is it leads to what's literally a worldwide calamity of essentially these just coastal cities being overrun. And so what ends up going on is the X-Men tell the Avengers, get out of here, go deal with that threat, we'll continue dealing with this here. So where the Avengers leave, the initial kind of offering by Exodus is, I told you guys, the Avengers were going to abandon us. And where Nightcrawler chimes in and says, no, the Avengers are on our side, that's not a fair assessment, Destiny chimes in. Now remember, Destiny is a mutant that can see the future. The further she looks into the future, the less clear her predictions come. And so because of that, because everything going on here is such a huge event, and because Destiny is able to see pretty accurately into the near future, she corrects Nightcrawler and says, no, that is the case. The Avengers really are abandoning us here. This is going to turn into a war where we are going to be fighting both the Avengers and the Eternals. We're going to be waging a war on two fronts. So it's one of those things to kind of correct that concern that you guys had of, okay, is this really going to work? No. This is exactly how the event's going to play out. It is really going to be the Avengers versus the X-Men versus the Eternals. Now, well, again, while that huge fight's taking place at Krakoa, we basically jump back to Iron Man, to Mr. Sinister, to the Eternals themselves, at least the ones who are not waging war against the X-Men. And you basically have them traveling around the world to different locations and basically grabbing little pieces of what are Celestials that have existed on Earth at some previous point in time or visited in some capacity. There was a point in the past where the thumb of Arishem the Judge had basically been left on Earth. I know it seems kind of weird, but that's effectively taken. There was a point where a piece of the Dreaming Celestial, who you guys probably recognize as Tiamu from the Eternals film, that Dreaming Celestial had been buried on Earth at one point in time, but there is a kind of life essence of the Dreaming Celestial that still resides here on Earth. At the same time, you also have the Destroyer armor of Asgard, which was created by Odin when they were initially dealing with the third host, the potential threat of the Celestials, and Odin and the Asgardians and even Zeus and the Olympians were all going to go to war with the Celestials. They ultimately never did. The Destroyer armor was annihilated, and that's when the Skyfathers realized, okay, we're kind of out of our league here. We're just going to leave these guys alone and let them do their thing. But one of the other big moments to know is that when it comes to the history of the Celestials on Earth, that they had not just been involved with the creation of the Eternals and the X-Men, or at least mutants as they would come to exist in Marvel Comics, but they also created the Deviants. But the Deviants were the ones who initially waged war on the Celestials. And so the Celestials had essentially annihilated most all of the Deviants and pushed them to the brink of extinction. The reason why this matters is because ever since that point in time, the Deviants view the Celestials with reverence. They view them as absolute gods. And so the significance of that is there is no group on Earth that knows more about the Celestials than the Deviants themselves. Even though the Eternals were created by the Celestials, even their knowledge is not that intense. Their knowledge is not as in-depth as the Deviants are. And so the more significant part of this is actually Tony Stark himself. And this is genius because in the Christopher Cantwell Iron Man comics, and partially even in the comics of the Incredible Hulk by Donny Cates, there came a point where Tony Stark had actually piloted a dead Celestial. Now, Tony Stark's done that several times. In fact, there was one point where he piloted the God Killer armor, which was amazing. And if you're curious about that, we do have a video on that. You'll see that card pop up here in a second. You're welcome to check that out when this video is finished, but it was just a ridiculously amazing story. But because Tony Stark has experience with basically using the bodies of Celestials, and because his body remembers what it means to be a part of a Celestial, his nervous system is basically being copied and is going to be the blueprint. And so what this basically means is that by them going around and collecting all these different parts, and you've probably figured this out, they're going to use this to rebuild the progenitor celestial. They're remaking a celestial. Now, the thing that happens here is we switch back over to the X-Men themselves, right? We switch back over to the mutant nation of Krakoa, and again, you have this massive fight that takes place. Now, where Exodus had already destroyed one of the Hex Eternals, what this does is it leads him to facing off against another Eternal known as Sign. Now, one of the things to remember is that Exodus is a telepath and telekinetic of the highest order. This guy's power is rivaled by very precious few people. And depending on what era we're talking about in Marvel Comics, not even Jean Grey, who was at one point a host for the Phoenix Force, not even Jean Grey's power is on par with this guy. But the full brunt of Exodus' power comes to bear when he faces off against Sign. And in doing so, Sign actually sends out this kind of telepathic message to Exodus, which he ignores or potentially doesn't even notice because of the moment, where Sign simply says, please don't. But Exodus basically detonates himself, and in doing so, unleashes all of his telekinetic energy at one time and destroys Sign the Eternal. Now, the thing about this, and this is what's so funny here, is initially the X-Men celebrate this as a moment of reprieve. They celebrate it as, okay, we destroyed that Eternal. Basically, everything is okay. Let's just kind of keep on keeping on, which, by the way, I may have referred to some of the Eternals as Celestials. My bad. The giant robot things you see, those are basically Eternals here. The only Celestial that's part of this is the Celestial that's being recreated or being rebuilt by Tony Stark and all those guys. But the thing behind this is, and one of the things to remember, and this was established during Kieran Gillen's run, the dark reality of the Eternals, which they didn't know about, is that every single time one of them dies, they're resurrected, which they did know about. What they didn't know is a random human life is taken to basically resurrect that Eternal. There's no rhyme or reason behind why it happens. So while the X-Men do have the ability to resurrect their own, and they prioritize those who were either the most powerful or those who were basically fighting on the fronts at the moment, the Eternals resurrect themselves as well. The difference here is that when Exodus is resurrected, there is a kind of limit. When the X-Men resurrect themselves, their minds are basically backed up. And so when Exodus was resurrected, it's the most recent backup for his character, essentially meaning it was before this war broke out. So while he is telepathically reminded of everything that went on, for him, it's information. When Sign, the Eternal, is resurrected, she remembers not only the events and everything that transpired, but how she felt. And when she had begged for her life for Exodus not to kill her, and he did it anyway, now it involves hate. And the war is right back on again. That literally Sign immediately goes back on the attack, like shows right back up again, goes right back on the attack. And when that happens, Sign had remembered everything and learned. And that's the difference, that the X-Men are able to learn to a degree, but they're you know, when they're resurrected, their memories have to basically be provided to them by way of secondhand information. And that's what's going on here with the Eternals, that the Eternals being resurrected, they're resurrected exactly as they were before. Like the moment they died, they remember everything, including their emotional state, and they remembered everything they saw, all the weaknesses and all the strengths of the conflict. And that's why Sign looks at everything going on and says, okay, the only way to really basically stop these X-Men is to destroy the island on which they live. And so Sign immediately starts attacking the island. Now, it's one of these moments where literally they're just like, we can't stop, like we can't stop her. Like Sign's resurrected here, like we just have people coming back, we're still in the process of resurrecting. Like Exodus could potentially destroy Sign again, but the reality here is if he tried that, Sign would actually stop him, because Sign would know that's exactly what he was going to do. Sign learned from the past experiences, and so literally all hope is lost here. The mutant nation of Krakoa is about to be obliterated. Even Nightcrawler, right, a man of God, is just like, please deliver us from this. And that right then is when the Celestial comes online, and the Celestial immediately sticks his hand out and says, cease. And like everybody stops. The war just stops. Just like that. Like the Eternals back off. Everything just ends. And it's one of those crazy moments because it's just kind of like, okay, you know, like you literally have Iron Man, and you've got Riri Williams, and you've got the Eternals who have sided with the X-Men and the Avengers, and who are like, okay, cool, everything's copacetic, we brought back this Celestial, it's under our control. Nope, wrong. This is the most powerful Celestial ever because it's an amalgamation of all the other Celestials merged into one using the bits and pieces of technology that could be found. It's Frankenstein. It's a Frankenstein Celestial, but it's still the most powerful Celestial. And unlike what they had previously believed to have been the case, which was they could control it, the reality is they can't, because it exists, therefore it judges. And it literally says, people of Earth, listen, you are bickering children. The planet is ruined. You have acted with unrelenting unkindness to one another. You leave me no option. This is your judgment day. You have 24 hours to justify your existence. You will be judged individually. You will be judged as a collective. If there's more good than evil among you, you will live. But if you are found lacking, there will be no tomorrow. I will annihilate every single one of you. What happens here, and this is one of the coolest things, right? What happens here is you basically have the progenitor celestial analyzing everybody here, right? Looking over every single person. And the first person he hones in on is Captain America, right? He literally says, once more, Captain America seeks to inspire. He thinks himself a leader, one who sets the drumbeat for the world. I will judge him first. And so he basically appears, or at least kind of manifests, this sort of perfect looking Captain America type thing and says, you are a dream of a better country, right? That's literally what you represent, a better America. You have tried to inspire it for a century. This country is the world leader, and the world is what it is. It is worse every single day. You, Captain America, have failed. Captain America initially rejects this and is like, we're not playing this game, right? We're not doing the game with this stupid thing. We're basically blowing off all of this. And so in the end, he's like, we need to figure out how it is that we're basically going to satisfy the judgment of this celestial on a broader scale. Now, that's one of the cool elements of Captain America. Very rarely does Steve Rogers ever succumb to like mind games and shadow tricks, right? That almost never works on Steve Rogers. Not because he's immune to it, right? Like a telepath could screw up the mind of Steve Rogers with relative ease, right? What makes Steve Rogers so cool is that he has this level of fortitude and this level of leadership that is respected by everybody in pretty much the entirety of the Marvel Universe. But the thing about this is we basically transition over to the exclusion zone. Now remember, the exclusion zone is basically where Eternals are resurrected when they die, or it's where they're held prisoner. Specifically, we have Druig, who again is the leader of the Eternals, which is basically fractured. So you've got Druig, who's leading a group of Eternals and pretty much most of the Eternal Empire that wants to destroy the mutant population because they're quote unquote excess deviation. Remember, that's one of the big things the story's doing, is this establishing that mutants didn't just arbitrarily come into existence. They're basically humans that have a deviant gene and have just developed powers as a result of that. But Druig is literally talking here to Uranos, and Uranos wants to be set free. Now remember, in the last few videos that we did, we saw how powerful Uranos was. He showed up to Mars, which is a settlement that has mutants on it, but not just any mutants. They're all Omega level mutants, right? The most powerful of the mutant race. And he killed like 98% of them in 1 hour. That's how powerful that guy is, right? He's just on a whole new level of strength. It's kind of crazy. What we end up having in this conversation is, of course, Uranos, who says, okay, the Celestials already judged Captain America and found him to be a failure. So now the question is, how long before it judges everybody else? And in reality, it's kind of a race against time here, because the perception of Druig and those Eternals who were on his side is that our mission as Eternals is to correct quote unquote excess deviation, which only ever comes in two forms. Either it's deviants who have like basically mutated further and they have to be destroyed. They become deviants that basically kill other deviants and even Eternals, or it's humans with a deviant gene that have developed powers, i.e. mutants. And the fact that he's like, we haven't killed basically every mutant on Earth, that's the failure of our charter. That's why it will judge against us. And so his stance is we have to eradicate them as fast as possible. Now, where you do have the Druig-led Eternals, which are like, we have to kill basically all the mutants on Earth if we possibly can. And then you've got those Eternals that are working against him. Tony Stark basically working alongside the Eternals that stand on the side of the X-Men, along with basically Mr. Sinister, who's a mutant that they kidnapped. Ultimately, Tony Stark's approaching this from the perspective of like, how do we shut down that Celestial? Now, one of the things to remember here is Tony Stark has experience with this. Don't forget the God Killer armor, right? The God Killer armor was a suit of armor, really was just kind of a giant robot that was developed by the aspirants when they originally went to war with the Celestials at the beginning of all of creation. That 25,000 foot tall piece of metal, that was controlled by Tony Stark. He's also created armors that allow him to tap into celestial energy, right? To basically control a Celestial. So he's well aware of like how to deactivate these things. The problem is even those Eternals who were on the side of the X-Men are like, no, because the reality of this is the Eternals see the Celestials as like their prophesized beings. They don't really agree with what the Celestial's doing, but they believe the best way to overcome the judgment of Earth is to basically unify the world not to destroy the Celestial itself. But the other part of this is their programming. Remember, Eternals were created by Celestials, and the result of this is that the programming of the Eternals is that if a Celestial is on Earth and if it is in danger, they have to respond. It'll override their conscious thoughts. They'll literally just become robots, basically, that have to run through and save a Celestial and destroy whatever threat is standing against them. And that's kind of where you have these two groups at odds. Tony Stark thinks the best possible thing is to destroy it. These Eternals that are on the side of the Avengers and the X-Men just refuse to let that happen. And so what you end up doing is, again, jumping back to Krakoa, where you have the X-Men, basically the most powerful mutants on Earth, who are standing against the Hex. Now remember, one of the things that had happened here in this story, this whole Avengers, X-Men, Eternal story, is it basically removed the Eternals from just being a handful of people who live on Earth and sometimes they get involved in stuff, and instead it turned them into a whole society. And one of the things that we learned is that the Hex are basically the foot soldiers, right? They're like the special forces guys of the Eternals. They're enormous. They're as big as skyscrapers, but like they're the ones the Eternals dispatch if things get really, really bad. They have to go to war and basically just run over some enemy with overwhelming force. And that's what they have to do with Krakoa, because some of the most powerful beings in existence in the mutant population, and even just at all in Marvel Comics, are in Krakoa. So they have to approach accordingly. And so for the most part, the X-Men are literally fending off as best they can. And you even have Destiny, who can kind of see the future depending on how far out she's looking, who basically meets with Emma Frost, one of the most powerful telepaths on Earth, and is like, we need to basically have some kind of a meeting. But the reality here is Emma Frost is like, I mean, we can, but just keep in mind, like, while we're telepathically communicating, we're also fighting out here on the battlefield. Destiny basically says, okay, like, I've looked through the various options, and the only way for us to really come out on top here is to launch a strike force against the Celestial, because I've seen what happens with this battle. And if we continue fighting like this, we will lose. Because the reality here is that every time a mutant dies, sure, we can resurrect ourselves, but we basically have to be fed information on what happened, which is secondary knowledge. When an Eternal dies and they're resurrected by the Great Machine, they remember everything, right? They remember every single thing. The experiences, not only that, they learn, they correct and they learn, which means they are going to get the upper hand on us at some point in time. This battle cannot keep going on or they will kill us all. So launching this strike force is the only way to do it. Now, initially, some of them are kind of against it. They're like, no, we should not do that. Like, we should not launch a strike force and try to destroy a Celestial, because what if it doesn't work? Like, what if we try to blow up a Celestial and it doesn't work? He's gonna eradicate us all. Right? He's gonna kill us all just for pissing him off. And that's exactly the real concern to have here. But the other part of this is that some of the mutants there are like, but it's a risk worth taking. It's one worth doing. And so what you end up having is also Emma Frost, who says yes, but we also have a third option, right? Here on Krakoa, we've been waging war or fighting against the Eternals, and we can only fight for so long. But there is a force out there that we have not tapped into yet that will ally themselves to our cause. And that's when you transition over to the Krakoan gates. Now remember, only those who have a mutant gene can pass through the Krakoan gates. And if there were any doubt in Marvel Comics as to whether or not mutants are a genetic offshoot of the deviants, this confirms it. This solidifies that it's an absolute truth, because the other force that Emma Frost was referring to are the deviants themselves. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that deviants are as powerful as Eternals under any normal circumstance. And depending on what deviant you're talking about, some of them are more powerful than the Eternals. So literally what you have is Emma Frost, who has basically made bargains with the deviants, and an entire army of deviants comes swelling in. To give you guys perspective here, remember at the end of Avengers Endgame when you had like just what was left of the Avengers facing off against like the entire army of Thanos, and then all the portals start opening up, and basically every superhero that we've ever seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe up to that point all emerges at the same time? That's this. That's basically what's going on here. And so what this does is it drastically evens the odds. But even then, the prophecy of destiny remains. We cannot keep this battle going forever. We will inevitably lose. And so what this does is it switches back over to Tony Stark and the Eternals, who are all talking. And Tony Stark is adamant about this idea, right? Like, we have to find a way to destroy the Celestial, but but the Eternals simply won't let him. And in truth, there's not really anything Tony Stark can do to overcome the power of the Eternals, right? They're just way too capable for him. But in the midst of all this discussion that's going on, Mr. Sinister, ever the manipulator and the schemer, ends up going over to one of the computer panels and basically exposes a node for a Celestial, for the Celestial itself, that if it's attacked with enough energy, will blow the whole thing up. The big concern here is if they do that, what kind of collateral damage are they looking at, right? Say, for example, they detonate this Celestial. Say, for example, this Celestial does get blown up by some capacity. Millions of people in the immediate vicinity will die. But the stance of Mr. Sinister, and even Tony Stark to a degree, is yes, but future billions will live, right? This is just classic utilitarianism. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. There's no argument about that. There's no discussion about that, right? Like, that's just the way that it has to go. Now, again, while Sinister's doing that, you actually end up having the Eternals realizing that there's a secondary breach that's taken place here, that basically there's infiltrators. Some kind of a strike team has arrived to their location and is infiltrating the Celestial. And that's basically because of what's going on here, because the Celestial itself is now in immediate danger by way of the actions of Mr. Sinister, and the fact that Wolverine and Jean Grey and those guys have arrived as a strike force. The programming takes over, and immediately the Eternals turn on the X-Men, right? Those who were on the scene, and immediately attack them all, right? Like literally just, it's like this massive battle that takes place between all of them, right? These most powerful mutants that exist in Marvel Comics alongside, facing off against these Eternals. The war is extreme and it is harsh. And that's the crazy thing. At the end of the day, the X-Men, in kind of a last ditch effort, are able to pull off the attack, and they destroy the Celestial, which lets off this just colossal atomic explosion that eradicates millions of people, and then it ends. Then it stops. And then suddenly they realize the Celestial's not gone. The Celestial's there intact. And that's when Jean Grey comes to the realization none of that actually happened. There was no colossal battle. There was no major war. They were literally just shown by this Celestial what would have happened had they pulled off that attack. This is a strike against them, because what it means is that the population of Earth would rather have destroyed millions of people than find some peaceful resolution to their conflict. And so the Celestial doesn't necessarily use that as a sign of judgment and say, I judge against the entirety of the human race. But what it does do is it literally says, okay, it communicates with the entirety of the world, and it says, everybody on Earth, you need to know this, right? I have shown you, every single person on the face of the planet, I have shown you what this explosion would look like, and I've shown you the damage that it would do. You need to know that the people on this Earth, right, the superheroes that stand before you, that they see themselves as being gods above judgment. Now, all of you see that they are mistaken. Your day ticks away. You've got 24 hours to prove yourself. Remember, that was a statement the Celestial made. You have 24 hours to prove to me that you're a race worth saving. Your day ticks away. Justify yourself. That's a really, really important thing to understand, because to give you guys perspective here, Jean Grey is an immensely powerful telepath, right? On a universal scale. And the fact that a Celestial was able to just trick her and every other telepath on Earth into believing that what they were seeing was real is a testament to its level of power. That's why I say this is the most powerful Celestial to ever exist, because it's a combination of a multitude of other Celestials. And so what it does is it presents this scenario, kind of talking to us more as the reader than anything else, that it says more judgments, right? Thumbs down for the Woman of Diamond, for Emma Frost, right? She's one that probably deserves a thumbs down. She's kind of a prick. Thumbs up for the Deviant Warlord, right? Thumbs down for the woman who walks between futures and the woman who walks beside her, right? Destiny and her lover Mystique, that is going through each of these individual people and is judging in favor of them or against them. Now, the reality of this is that when it says, I will judge you individually and then I will judge you as a collective, what this seems to indicate is that each person is basically a tally. Thumbs up, thumbs down. If there are more thumbs downs across the entire spectrum of the human race than there are thumbs up, everybody gets destroyed, right? If there's more strikes against humanity than for humanity, or if there are more evil people in the world than good people, the world will end. If not, the world will be allowed to continue on. And so what you have is this really, really cool moment where you basically have this discussion where it's like, okay, they communicate with Captain America. And what Captain America says is, look guys, like this whole thing of us waging war against each other, this is not gonna work. If we keep on doing this and we keep on fighting each other, that's gonna do nothing but cause problems. What we need is someone who can unify the world. What we need is someone who can bring the world together. Son. Check this out. He's like, what we need is somebody that can unify the world, right? God, I love this moment so much. And so what this does is it switches switches over to Cersei. Now, Cersei has this idea. She ends up getting with Jack of Blades. Now remember, Jack of Blades is an Eternal who's an assassin, but knows how to get in and out of places that people aren't normally supposed to get in and out of. What he does is basically sneak her into the exclusion zone, into the Eternals prison and resurrection chamber, right? Kind of serving both purposes. And as they get in there, there's this kind of conversation where she's like, yes, like we need somebody who's going to unify the entirety of the Earth's population. God, I'm so excited about this. So what they do is they make their way to a vault. And when this person is like, who's there? Cersei responds and says, we're here to break you out. I think we're in terrible trouble, and I think you can help someone to get the world singing from the same hymn sheet. Now, I know this is Eternals business, but some of us have never been just Eternals. And I thought that perhaps it's time for a little of the old Avengers to assemble. And what we end up finding out is the person she's talking to is Eros, also known as Star Fox. For those of you guys who don't know why this guy is so important, Eros has the ability to manipulate the emotional states of people. What Eros could do, if his powers are pushed to the limit, what he could do is literally unify the entire world, even if it's against their will. The question you have to ask here is this the final straw? Because if Eros comes along and he manipulates the world into experiencing a sense of harmony and unification, will the Celestial see through it? Will he know it's an illusion? Or will they end up taking the powers of Eros and using it on a Celestial? Which begs the question, can he even do that? Now, what this does is this initially opens up with Captain America literally at like Central Park, right? Because that's where the giant X-Men tree is kind of emerged, where you basically have the kind of field base, right? This is where like the New York branch of the X-Men reside, but people are here because people are turning against the X-Men population. Remember, when it came to this whole thing, what's been going on behind the scenes is that you have had the X-Men and you've had the Eternals and you've had the Avengers facing off and kind of joining forces and then turning against each other and so on and so forth. But the other big caveat here is that the picture has been painted that the mutants are why this is all happening in the first place. The other part of this is that humanity has always had a fear of mutants. And so as a result, in this time of desperation, people look to the mutants as being the cause of the problem. Now, the irony of all this is Captain America is trying to talk everybody down. And that's one of the things that we're told, right? The world understands its heroes cannot save them. They must be their own heroes now. They must decide what hero means. And we're told by the Celestial, the tests are real. They cannot be shirked. The world shows its true face, and I watch. Captain America failed his test and prays others do not do likewise. So the man in the flag tries to inspire people to not bludgeon one another to death. There's riots in the streets, riots in the country, riots in the homes, riots in the hearts, and Captain America can't be everywhere. And this is really what the Celestial was hitting at, right? This is what the progenitor was hitting at in the last video that we did when it analyzed Captain America and called him a failure. Because in reality, Captain America is a hero that people look up to. He's just kind of the center of the superhero community. Everybody respects him, and the average person knows who he is. But in times of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe, and logic will fly out the window in replace of an emotional response. People are angry and they're scared, and in their anger and fear, they will become the worst versions of themselves. Captain America's speeches and talking to them and trying to get people to calm down, it has no bearing whatsoever, so much so that people actually turn against Captain America because their thought is not Captain America is here trying to like talk reason into us and get us to, you know, get the day to calm down. Instead, their Captain America is trying to stand in the way of us destroying the thing that will fix everything. Captain America wants us to die, and in turn they turn on him because of that. And that's the crazy thing, because at this point we switch our attention over to Eros. Now remember, Eros was the revelation of the person the Eternals reached out to effectively save them, and Eros was a guy who could do it. Remember, Eros has the ability to manipulate the emotions of others. He is a pure empath, which means he can live and he can feel the emotions of others in a variety of different ways. The funny thing about this is Eros immediately counters the point of Iron Man and Cersei and those guys when their stance is, Eros, we need you to use your powers in order to basically manipulate the emotions of humanity to essentially instill peace on a global scale, and then the Celestial will have to rule in our favor. Eros' response, that's ridiculous. If I do that, the Celestial will see right through it. He will immediately know what it is that's going on, that he will see that in the moment they are peaceful, but the reality is that in their heart of hearts, that they're still just as terrible as they ever were. What has to be done here in order to bend the Celestial's will to our favor, in order to save our world, is to somehow convince this Celestial that in their heart of hearts, while it may not seem like it, people are inherently good. And so what we end up doing here is actually kind of following the progenitor as it goes through and starts analyzing people. One of the things it says is that on his way home, angry at the world, Tom passes two other angry men who decide that he looks kind of Eastern European, and they have strong angry opinions about that, and so they beat him up because of it. The response that the Celestial had is Tom spits out a tooth and fails to see the irony, and so he fails, right? The Celestial looks to Luke Cage and says, Luke Cage is mayor. This is his first extinction event. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, when you originally had Kingpin, who was the mayor of New York during like the entire just crazy situation where Kingpin basically tried to take over the city of New York, Luke Cage ran against him, since basically attacking Kingpin would effectively make him a martyr and would turn people to his side. So Luke Cage ran against him and won, and that's how Luke Cage became mayor of New York. If you guys are curious about that, I'll link the playlist to that video down in the description. But nonetheless, right, the progenitor says he poses as a man of the press and asks him, how do you judge your performance as mayor? And the response of Luke Cage is a political answer. Ask me tomorrow, right? Kind of joking about it a little bit and sort of easing the tension. And the response of the progenitor is, that is not an option. To take no stance is not an option. And he judges against Luke Cage. He then analyzes Thor, and he says Thor Odin's son fights the Phoenix in orbit. Mutual powers like dueling suns. I observe him closely. I read his hammer's inscription and ascertain a truth. By definition, he must be worthy. So Thor passes the test. And then he looks to Eros. And the funny thing about this is he doesn't pass judgment on Eros. Instead, he watches as Eros just listens to other people. Eros literally travels around the world and hears people's stories, listens to what they have to say, and then just absorbs that information. But the Celestial then turns to Kamala Khan, right, to Miss Marvel, and he says, I appear before Kamala Khan as Captain Marvel, offering her and her family a chance to leave the planet, escape this, and join the secret higher league of Marvel heroes. She pummels me and demands I tell her what I did with the real Carol. She cannot see my hand move in her huge fist, but she passes and I vanish. Now, the cool thing about this, and this is what's so ironic, is it's not just the progenitor judging superheroes, it's the progenitor judging everybody. And so one of the things he says is a woman named Katrina leaves her hotel room on her way to a rally. She's 50 meters down the corridor before she realizes she forgot a tip. She looks at the distance back, knows she's late, and decides not to go back and deliver a tip and carries on. And the progenitor says, I appear to her in the form of her dead aunt with a thumbs down. She's mortified and she asks, what did I do? And I simply just don't tell her. Time and time again, it's the same thing. It appears to Charles Xavier as Legion and says, I need to talk. Charles Xavier does what he's always done, which is blow off his son, and the Celestial judges against him. The Celestial continues to watch Eros. The Celestial judges the Starbrand, judges in favor of her. The Celestial judges a woman named Daniela as Daniela watches all the footage going on. And in that moment, with Daniela's relationship with her mother being strained at the very best, she decides she needs to be there for her mom. She goes home, the Celestial judges in her favor. Now, one of the funny things that happens here is the Celestial appears to Dr. Doom. Now, you guys know how Dr. Doom is, right? You guys know how Victor Von Doom is, right? Literally, the Celestial appears and says, I appear to Victor Von Doom and give him a simple challenge. Say that Reed Richards is smarter than you, and you will pass. He laughs and then laughs some more and then leaves. He passes himself. I concur. Like, literally, Dr. Doom's like, I'm not taking your stupid test. I decide that I pass. And the Celestial's like, I mean, oh, okay, you know. But it's, again, one of those great moments, because then it appears to Daredevil, right? And this is one of those interesting things, because remember, Daredevil's Catholic. He's a man of faith. And one of the things the Celestial says is Matt Murdock dresses as a devil and tries to stop the streets from becoming hell. He is a man with a firm moral code, which he has violated time and time over. I appear with a crown of thorns and a downturned thumb. Beneath the mask, Matt Murdock weeps. He says, I know, yet he carries on. And that's the crazy thing. It's just one of these amazing and beautiful moments that goes on here. And so ultimately, after everything that's happened, the Celestial continues his judgments of various people and even superheroes across the world. But then you have Eros, who appears to a coming together of the United Nations. And he literally says, okay, for all of you out there, here's the thing to understand. And it's really him learning this. Humanity will not come together just because it's the right thing to do. It's not in the nature of people to do that. The nature of humanity is to be destructive. It's to ruin things, destroy things, not necessarily because it's ingrained in our evolutionary biology, but because it's just what we've been doing for so long, drawing boundaries over pieces of land to differentiate between one nation and another, one human being looking at another and saying, because of your skin color or your gender or what have you, you're different from me and that makes you bad. Just things along those lines, right? As primitive as those ideologies are, Eros came to the realization that humanity has been doing it for so long, it doesn't know anything else. And so using that to his benefit, he approaches the United Nations and says, if you won't come together because it's the right thing to do, then maybe I can just bribe you to do so, right? As it stands right now, the X-Men and the Eternals have technology that you as normal humans simply just don't have. Not only that, if you are willing to come together and bring your countries together and unify in a way that will save our world, then we will also grant you celestial technology, not on a massive scale, but something that will basically help to usher in humanity into a golden age, because the reality is we as Eternals have had this technology for a pretty lengthy amount of time. And for the most part, our unwillingness to share it with you has in a lot of ways been a failure. We could have actually turned Earth into a golden age, but we just never really did for any number of reasons. The X-Men have recently discovered this power and they've kept it selfishly, and the celestial power is out there for humanity to be used. We will guide you. We won't just give it to you arbitrarily, but we will give you the tools you need to move beyond your current primitive standpoint of drawing artificial boundaries that are literally guaranteed by virtue of just yellow marks along the road. And in turn, we will help you become better. And so that's one of the ideas here, is that hopefully it will lead to a unification of humanity. But the other concern here, and the bigger thing they have to deal with, is Uranos. Because remember, Uranos is one of the original Eternals. This guy's so powerful, he showed up on Mars, a planet full of Omega level mutants, and eradicated pretty much everybody, right? Within 1 hour. This guy's on just a whole different level of power, and he's basically being used by Druig, who's the current leader of the Eternals and the one that really instigated this war in the first place. And so the issue the Eternals have to deal with is their numbers are fractured. Their numbers are split. They can't just launch an attack against Druig because he's the leader of the Eternals. It'd be like just assassinating some kind of world leader. You can't do that, right? Because it'll turn the other Eternals against them. And in fact, it'll actually incite a civil war among the Eternals. What they need is for Druig to screw up, to make a mistake, to do something that will basically lead to the other Eternals losing faith in him and then voting him out as the Prime Eternal and voting somebody in his stead. But that's the concern when it comes to dealing with Uranos, because their fear here is that what if Druig will unleash Uranos on Earth itself? What could he possibly do? Like, imagine the amount of damage he could inflict here. Now, the crazy thing about this and the funny thing about this is that the entire concern with regards to voting for Druig is limited to the existing Celestials, right? They can at any point in time initiate a vote of no confidence, right? They can at any point in time, the Eternals can come along and say, we call for a vote of no confidence in Druig and we want to elect a new leader. The issue is, if they do that, their numbers are split almost perfectly even. If they were to launch that vote, what it would do is it would lead to effectively the entirety of the eternal landscape staying exactly as it is right now, because those who voted for Druig are going to vote for him again. Those who voted against him are going to vote against him again. There won't be any real change. What they need is somebody who can turn the tide. And so what happens here is that Druig ultimately summons the Unimind, right? He does this as a means to launch a psychic attack against the Omega level telepaths on Earth in the hopes of annihilating all of them. But in his hubris in doing this, in overlooking and overplaying his hand, what this does is it allows a field team to infiltrate the exclusion zone, right? Remember, the exclusion zone is the great machine of the Eternals. Everything that makes the Eternals who they are is literally confined to that, including the ability to quote unquote hack into the Unimind. And that's exactly what happens, that when the defense systems of the Unimind are effectively down, this allows the mutants to enter into the mind of the Unimind itself. It allows the telepaths to enter in directly. Now, this is a major change when it comes to the nature of mutants in Marvel Comics. Something that I want to establish here is that yes, mutants and deviants do possess similar genes, genes. And basically mutants are descendants of deviants, hence the reason why deviants were able to pass through the Krakoan gates, because the genetic material of deviants and mutants is close enough that they're distant relatives, essentially, right? Mutants are the result of humans with a deviant gene. The difference here is that under any normal circumstance, the Unimind is confined to Eternals only. The mutants are not Eternals here. So under any normal circumstance, the mutants would never be able to enter into the Unimind and then vote for a new Prime Eternal. What's happened here is that by hacking the firewall of the Unimind and in turn allowing other minds to enter into it, that what this does is with the vote being cast, it cannot be done. It's irrevocable, right? Druid can't say, no, they can't vote because they're mutants, right? It doesn't count. Once the vote is made, the vote is guaranteed. There's no conceivable way to undo it or to change it. It doesn't matter. And so as a result of that, when the mutants vote, they vote in favor of Eros. But what it does is it changes the landscape in that Eros is voted as the new Prime Eternal. The problem with this is that moments before the vote is cast, Druid, in an act of desperation, unleashes Uranos on Earth with the belief that Uranos, in his promise, would basically solve the problem by eliminating the mutant population and ensuring that the forces of Druid would remain in control. What Uranos did was abandon the promise, so the vote went through. The result of this is that Eros becomes the new Prime Eternal, and Uranos is now free on Olympia and even free on Earth. The reason why this matters is because, remember, Uranos can tap into the armory of the Eternals. In doing so, quite literally, portals start opening all over the world, and just massive beings of astronomical power begin to show up because of the forces or the power of Uranos to essentially summon them. Now, the crazy thing about this is that no one really knows what to do here, right? Iron Man is like, okay, we have to find a way to essentially utilize the very weapons of Uranos against him, right? What we need is someone out there, man, let me tell you something, what we need is somebody out there that has the ability to seize control of the very metals that Uranos uses for his guns and arms and armament and all that stuff. And as Uranos is gearing up and Uranos is prepping all these massive weapons to start opening fire and unleashing just hellfire on the world itself, the master of magnetism appears, son. Magneto makes his return, baby. Yes, remember, Magneto was one of the people who was thought to have been killed by Uranos on Mars. This guy, right, the power of Magneto, his heart was ripped out of his chest. This guy used his own control over magnetism to keep the blood flowing in his body, to give himself an artificial heart so he could continue fighting. And this guy is incensed. This guy is 8 kinds of pissed. And so when the deal is made, right, like when Tony Stark hacks into the systems, into the entire armory of Uranos, and he's like, Magneto, are you there, right? The response to Magneto is, yes, I'm ready whenever you are, right? Like Tony Stark opens the portals to the various weapons, right? These just massive energy cannons that Uranos has, and then literally all the cannons end up targeting Uranos with the help of Magneto. And in that moment, Magneto's just like, fire! And then just the whole thing just goes off and incinerates Uranos on the spot. Just kills Uranos right there on the spot. Now, one of the things you remember, Eternals never die, they always get resurrected. So the result of this is that yes, Uranos is destroyed in the moment, the momentary issue is quelled. He's sent back to his containment cell where he starts to reconstruct himself, but lest we forget what it was Magneto did. Do not forget here, when it comes to mutants, they can always be resurrected so long as they're in the database. But in order to truly become a member of Arakko society, that Magneto deleted himself from the database of Krakoa, meaning if he dies, there's no coming back. And Magneto dies. He had just enough energy to basically keep himself alive, right? Just enough power to keep himself there. And in that moment, he ultimately passes on, right? He ultimately ends up dying. And so as a result of this, the Progenitor Celestial, monitoring everything, right, literally says, this is the moment. Magneto could weaken, he could call out to his old friend who would still save him. I listen, and there is nothing. He does not betray his promise to the Arakko people. He truly is a guy who's maintaining his role in Arakko, right? Maintaining the deal that was made. He's not a betrayer of his own word. And in turn, the Progenitor says, he sees me as I slip away. I take on the form of the one he thought he lost. She smiles and waves approvingly. If all were like him, there would be no need for men like him. But look, this is of interest to me. And what you end up having is Eros, who approaches the progenitor celestial. And the response of Eros is this: look, I have traveled the world and I have talked to all different manner of people. I have spoke to them, I've heard their words, I've made deals with them. And the reality here is that we as people can be better. We can improve, we can be more capable, but we can't do it in a day. We need more than a day. By tomorrow, we can become better. And that's when the progenitor is like, it's time, right? I do not address the world. I have spoken enough. I have watched enough and I have judged enough. And I have decided you have all lived enough. If you had 1,000,000 years, you'd never do enough. You'll always be better tomorrow. Tomorrow things will be different. Tomorrow you will improve. It's always tomorrow. It's always tomorrow. It's always tomorrow. And he says, but you don't realize that one day tomorrow would run out. And the progenitor judges against the entirety of humanity and starts eradicating all life on Earth. But the thing about this is that in this comic and in this story, the God Celestial in the last video that we did had examined the real heart of hearts when it came to individual people. It looked at a combination of how they see themselves, how they see the world, their actions, what they truly believe, all those different things. And it judged against humanity because it made the decision that humanity just simply made the world a crappy place, because humanity in and of itself is really self-destructive, selfish, different things like that. And what the God Celestial does is, looking at humanity as it exists in the Marvel universe, that it looks at humanity as being a group whereby there is more negativity than there is positivity. Humanity is inherently worse than it is beneficial. Now, the funny thing about this is that to a degree, the God Celestial is not really judging objectively. And this comes by way of a girl named Jada who meets with Captain America. That Steve Rogers was one of the first people to be judged by the God Celestial. And in looking at Steve Rogers, basically came up with this idea, or came up with this argument, that you have positioned yourself, you weren't thrust into this role, you positioned yourself as being kind of the moral focal point of the superhero community, right? You're Captain America. Everybody rallies around you. You have failed in your role. It's almost to a degree a kind of metatextual critique of America here in the real world, right? Like a beacon of hope and light in the world, and a task that we've kind of failed at. And that's the argument that it creates here with Captain America. But the reality here is it is a skewed judgment, because there comes a point when Captain America is talking to Jada, who's just a regular person out there. And it's one of those things where we end up finding out that she had lost her daughter when she was younger, and literally is just angry at the world because of it. And in fact, she's angry at the people she knows because they survived where her daughter died. Now, that's usually a normal reaction when it comes to like losing someone close to you, right? Losing a parent, especially if you're a parent who's lost a child. You're surrounded by people who survived, and the question you probably find yourself asking is, why are they alive? Why did my child have to die? Why couldn't one of them have died instead, or something along those lines? As if it's some kind of divine judgment that says that like somebody's got to die today, and it might as well be your daughter, right? Like, well, why couldn't it be that person over there? It's not logical, it's 100% emotional, but it's the nature of people. And it's one of the things where when she has this conversation with Captain America, he's kind of like, but you should be spending time with your family, right? We're here in the final moments of humanity's existence. You should be spending that time with your family. It's him trying to inspire her. And that's where you really start to realize that the judgment of the Celestial is a skewed judgment here. Because when you look at Captain America for what he truly is, he is inspiring. He is a person that's able to motivate and drive people to become better. What you end up running into is basically people who aren't really able to look at that inspiration and see it for what it is, and find themselves blinded by their own political views or their own life experiences or their own moral compass or whatever it happens to be, that basically keeps them thinking small and acting small and viewing the world in relation to themselves. Now, of course, in the midst of this conversation, Nightcrawler simply appears and says, hey, so we're basically going to try to find a way to save the world, even though the world hates us and the world judges us as mutants. But do you want to become a part of it? And so what ends up happening is Captain America kind of has this realization where he basically tells Nightcrawler, teleport me to the Celestial. And when that happens, have Jean Grey use her telepathic powers to broadcast the entire situation to the world. And what Captain America says in speaking to this Celestial is, he says, I've stood before tyrants before. They've all been so sure that it's all over. They were all as sure as you are. I was there in 1940 and people thought it was over. Heroism is not about strength. It's about not giving in. And the truth is, it's not over as long as any of us are standing. The world can hear me, know this. We are all Avengers now. Assemble and avenge. Now, of course, Captain America is annihilated in front of everybody by the Celestial, but the world sees this broadcast, and that's the unifying factor of Captain America. The question then becomes, how successful would we be if we launched a strike against the God Celestial itself? Now, the Eternals chime in, and the Eternals are like, lest we forget the nature of our programming. If we attack a Celestial, we'll be overtaken by it, right? Our programming will take over, and we'll in turn start attacking you guys. It's exactly what happened before. But they also found a workaround. What they ended up doing was basically kind of lowering their psychic firewalls, right? If their programming is ingrained into their DNA, because in Marvel Comics, Eternals are not robots, but if their mind is more or less programmed with this idea that no Celestial can be harmed in the presence of an Eternal, then what would happen if a powerful enough telepath were capable of overriding that? That if they lowered their mental protection, right, their mental blocks, and someone like Jean Grey were to seize control of them and that programming were to kick in, is Jean Grey powerful enough to override it? And the answer to that question is absolutely she is. And not just Jean Grey, the other telepaths. And so what ends up happening here is that all forms of disagreement are cast aside by the Eternals who are here, as well as the X-Men and the remaining Avengers. And what this does is it allows the group to unify. Now for the telepaths, they seize control of the Eternals. And what that does is it allows them to control the Eternals essentially, but to also keep out the programming, so it will allow the Eternals to attack the Celestials. And when I say the Eternals, I mean all of them, even the Hex, right? Just these ridiculously huge and powerful Eternals. It allows them to control them all. And so what you end up getting is this unified force of the Avengers and the X-Men and the Eternals, all of whom launch their attack against the Celestial. And it's the funniest thing, because literally this Celestial says they are Earth's best hope. Mortal power against a star god. The buzz of ballistics cannot hurt me. However, it does distract. It allows the Hex to get close. Each one of the Stepford Cuckoos, who are basically clones of Emma Frost, each one of the Stepford Cuckoos drives one of the soldier Hex. Mother Emma takes Mother Regenax. They are machines designed to fight cosmic predators such as myself. Their attack compromises my counterattack, leaving me open for reposit. I am a god. Appropriately, they unleash hell. Yet all of this is prologue. The hammer is still to come. Earth's mightiest strike is won. Their target is exposed. They are a metaphorical hammer. The final blow is from one more literal, right? The hammer of Thor himself. I am impressed. I see so many brought together, but I have already finished my judgment. What god would I be if I backed out now? Yes, Thor is worthy, but the world is not. I make every part of Thor unworthy. His skin sloughs from his body in revulsion. Starbrand burns. Phoenix burns, Jean Grey burns, Exodus burns, Phosphorus fast. They are all gone. It's basically like a total annihilation here. This is something that I want to point out, is that these heroes getting close enough to this god Celestial and being close enough to attack it, it was him allowing it to happen. If anything, it was actually him just kind of toying with them, allowing them to believe they could come that close to victory, allowing them to believe that they ever even stood a chance in the first place. But the reality is, none of them ever did. He kills all of them. All of them are completely annihilated by the Celestial. Like, we're talking about Carol Danvers, we're talking about Spider-Man, right? Thor, the whole 9 yards. The heaviest hitters in Marvel Comics from a variety of different places are all being completely and totally annihilated, and there's nothing they can do to stop this. And so it literally says, I will burn the cities and I will burn the seas. I will burn the earth and all creatures of the earth. The passengers of this ship represent more wealth than the rest of the planet combined. The experimental engines prepare to engage, sights set on a new blue-green Eden. They think they can escape my judgment. No. One of the things that I also want to point out here is this is how Celestials work. So the way this normally happens, right? Usually it's Arishem the judge that will judge against the world. When Arishem judges against the world, then another Celestial will cleanse the planet. Quite literally, they'll turn it into a burning cinder, just floating through space. But then the gardener celestial will come in and actually start planting new seeds of life on the world, and it'll basically start to grow again, right? Life will be able to start all over again. And that's really what the God Celestial is doing here, right? It's making this determination that what it's going to do is annihilate all life on Earth and then start allowing Earth to basically start developing new life. And hopefully humanity won't screw up again when humanity inevitably reemerges, if it even emerges in its current form. And so that's one of those things where it's like, we don't know exactly how this will turn out, but everything is being cleansed and sanitized. It's all being completely and totally destroyed. The crazy thing about it is even the God Celestial tells the Earth it's time to die, and the Earth itself lashes back at the God Celestial and simply just refuses to allow itself to be destroyed. But the truth about this is that when it comes to all these heroes who have been annihilated, precious few survived. Something like 5 of them made it out in one piece. Most everybody else was completely eradicated. But remember, the other problem here is that when the war between the X-Men and the Eternals first broke out, the Jack of Blades had infiltrated Krakoa, and in doing that had destroyed their ability, or at least most of their ability, to resurrect anybody from the dead using the Krakoan resurrection system. And so because of that, what you have now is just a handful of eggs that can be used by the 5 to bring back anybody who's died. And so the effort to do this is really confined to, who do we bring back? Now the response of somebody like Exodus is, we have to bring back Cyclops. Cyclops is the field leader of the X-Men. He's the guy that was literally the one that would take us into battle, take us into conflict, right? He's our version of Captain America. But the response of Nightcrawler and even the response of everybody else is, no, that's not who the world needs right now. The world does not need like Cyclops. The world does not need him, right? The other part of this is that when they had initially launched their strike against the Celestial, they had consulted Destiny, right? Because remember, Destiny can see the future, and the closer to the present day or the present moment that she's predicting, the more accurate she is, right? So if she predicts or says, here's what's going to happen in 5 minutes, it's going to be way more accurate than if she says, here's what's supposed to happen in 500 years. But when they consulted her and they talked to her, her stance was, yes, your attack on the Celestial can work, but only with a few modifications. And so what they did is they held some of their number back with the intention of launching yet another strike force to infiltrate the Celestial. Now, where their initial strike force was done for the purpose of exposing some kind of weakness that would allow the superheroes to destroy the Celestial, that doesn't work. They already know that fails, so they have to have some other plan in place. We don't know the exact details of it, but basically it's Jack of Blades who leads the strike team into the Celestial itself. The problem with this is that when they arrive, the Celestial, as you would expect, immediately picks up on the fact that they're there, even though they have a cloaking system, and it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, it's very difficult to fool a Celestial using something like telepathy or just a basic cloaking device, because Celestials are just so astronomically powerful. But in order to fool the Celestial into believing that Jack of Blades is the only one who's actually there, that what Jack of Blades does is appear to the Celestial and literally just make some kind of offhanded remark, right? Like, I'll be seeing you, and draws the attention of the Celestial, which annihilates Jack. But it seems to lead the Celestial to believe that Jack was the only one who was there. That's actually not the case. But the thing about this is that when you pick back up with essentially this resurrection process, the members of the 5 who were able to bring people back, there's this debate going on between Exodus and Nightcrawler that's still raging, right? The stance of Exodus, we have to bring back Cyclops. We can't bring back anybody else. But again, what ends up happening is Nightcrawler says, no, this is the guy we have to bring back. And the response of Exodus is, this is heresy, right? We cannot use, it's against the rules of Krakoa to use these eggs to bring him back. It goes against everything that we have. And the stance of Nightcrawler is, no, it simply just goes against our customs, right? The only rule that we have when it comes to humanity is kill no man, right? Do not start a war between human beings and like the mutant population. But the other reason why this is so important is because he says, what are customs if not just habits that we have that a lot of people take part in, right? Getting together on Sunday for dinner is a habit, but it becomes a custom because it's something that like the entire family does. But the reality is, as long as we live, we have to try something new. That's what we do. Cyclops is a great leader, but he's not who the Earth needs right now. And so using the power of resurrection, what they end up doing is bringing this person back. And when that happens, in one of the greatest moments in Marvel Comics, Captain America's shield comes smashing through the mutant resurrection system. Now, the question you have to ask here is this: is this Steve Rogers as we knew him? Is this Steve Rogers with potential enhancements? Is Steve Rogers a guy with powers now? What kind of Captain America are we looking at here? Because lest we forget, whenever mutants are resurrected, they're always resurrected based on how they existed before, right? Meaning like their minds were backed up. And while Captain America is not a mutant, remember, you have Proteus here, who's the one resurrecting people, meaning Proteus can modify the DNA structure of anybody he resurrects. If there was a request that was made, we need to give Captain America more powers. We need to give him a combination of all the X-Men's powers or all the Avengers powers, or make him equal to the Celestial in terms of power. Presumably, Proteus could potentially do that. That's the question you have to ask here. Is this just human Captain America, or is it something more? But the thing about this is that where you did have the progenitor Celestial that basically annihilated everybody, there are some who made it out alive, specifically those individuals who were actually inside of the progenitor Celestial itself. Of course, Iron Man, Jean Grey, those individual guys. Now, the thing about this is that it really is, in the most true definition, a coming together of the Avengers, the X-Men, and the Eternals. And some of these guys have actually been both. For example, Wolverine has been both a X-Man and an Avenger. He's never been an Eternal. But nonetheless, right, their goal here is the same as it was before, to find some way to bring the progenitor Celestial down. Except this time, it's not the same, right? Previously, when they launched a strike team, it was to try to find a weak point and destroy that weak point. Obviously, that failed because of the fact that they were dealing with a being of just cosmic power. So somehow getting inside of it and trying to find a way to deactivate it or end it from the inside out is seemingly the only way to pull that off. Now, the irony behind all this, and this is one of those things where Marvel's kind of changing it either for the story or because it's just the future nature of things, is when they get inside of the Celestial itself. So the interior or the insides of a Celestial have been depicted in different ways in Marvel Comics. In different instances, they've said that Celestials are just beings composed of pure energy on the inside. In other instances, Celestials are actually beings you can enter into. The reality here, and this current depiction of the inside of a Celestial, has kind of been this way ever since Mr. Sinister had first entered into the Dreaming Celestial in Marvel Comics back in the day. So it's kind of the standard they're going with and will likely continue with for quite some time. But the important thing here is that once they're in there, they start to realize that the Celestial literally has an antibody system, right? It has what amounts to human white blood cells insides of it, or organisms inside of it, that are designed to basically force out any kind of external factor that's not supposed to be there. In this instance, those individual guys. Now, the most logical question to ask here is, if this is a being of unfathomable power, why didn't it just incinerate them while they're inside? And the answer to that is comic book logic, the necessity of being able to tell the story. So what this does is, of course, it leads to the X-Men, the Eternals, and the Avengers all kind of bailing out as fast as they can, but these different antibodies end up adhering themselves to Tony Stark. And that's when Tony Stark goes through this really cool process, because he almost kind of finds himself in this cave, so to speak, and sees the body of Ho Jensen. And then he's immediately attacked by the Iron Man suit Mark I, right? Like the first suit of armor that he ever made, as primitive as it was comparing to the kind of stuff that he has now. And it's one of those things where he's sort of taunted by it, right? Where even the suit goes as far as to say, look at your legacy, Tony, look at what you've done. You keep building suits, people keep dying. I am the end result of your efforts to build some being out there that can really be a testament to what you're capable of. And I've annihilated pretty much all the superheroes that you know. Your legacy, Tony Stark, is a legacy of death. And ultimately, it's one of those things where Tony Stark initially brushes it off, but then he starts getting these hard-on visions, like the death of Captain America. And that's one of the cool moments here, because this is in a lot of ways kind of the life and times of Tony Stark, or this sort of depiction of the people that Tony Stark has in some form or fashion led to the death of. Not directly, but the thing about this is it's kind of a reliving that moment where even Captain America pops up and it's like, I could be dead already, I could be dead again, and you may as well have killed me. And it's really just this instance where this Celestial is putting Iron Man through the paces and saying, you created me. You're the one that Frankensteined me together. It was your idea. This kind of goes directly into Christopher Cantwell's Iron Man run, which was just a phenomenal story. But basically, it was a story where Tony Stark ended up becoming what was called the Iron God, where he basically got Galactus's power. But for a time, Tony Stark was the most powerful being in the universe outside of like the super high level cosmic entities, right? Eternity, Infinity, Infinity, those guys. But in that story, he had actually killed James Rhodes and pretty much all of his allies, at least as far as his space friends team. But he's kind of taunted by that, right? Like, look at your legacy, Tony Stark. You killed me, right? James Rhodes kind of appearing as War Machine. And of course, he ended up kind of setting him back. But then he's basically shown or kind of presented with Ragnarok, right? Now, when it comes to Marvel Comics, Ragnarok appears in two different forms. There's the Ragnarok event, which is basically the death of all the Asgardians, right? The foretold prophecy of how the Asgardians will die. And then there was Ragnarok in the form of the Thor robot that Iron Man had created using a strand of Thor's hair and kind of cloned him and created a sort of cyborg in the process. But during the original Civil War event, when Ragnarok was originally presented to the world, it killed Bill Foster. And so Tony Stark is kind of confronted with that. Like, your legacy is one of death and destruction. Your legacy is one where people end. Like, literally it says, you tried it with me and you saw what happened. You never learn. But the truth, right now, a god was needed. You were the Iron God and you gave it up. If you were still the Iron God, you could have fought this Celestial, returned all to life, undone all woe, if only you had held it together for a few more weeks. Now, one of the things that I also want to point out here is that for these different circumstances that Tony Stark is being presented with, Tony Stark is presenting himself in a humble way. He's not ingratiating himself, but he's accepting his faults and accepting his failures. Like, in response to the idea of him having been the Iron God, having had the power of Galactus, his response is, it was too much for me and it's too much for anyone. And even here it's kind of stated, you're right, you could have never held it together. Men like you are slowly killing the planet. At least this cuts to the chase. You're an addict. Always will be. You're off booze and now you're addicted to saving the world. Bigger risk, bigger high. How fine can you cut it? Eventually, you are always going to push it too close. That it's really one of those things where it's like, he's always going from one addiction to another addiction, right? It's the nature of Tony Stark in Marvel Comics. And so as one of those things where following that, he's presented with the Incredible Hulk. This, of course, is a homage to the original Sin story. For those of you guys who never read that, one of the things that had gone on there is that there was the original project that had led to Bruce Banner becoming the Incredible Hulk was actually a joint venture between Tony Stark and Banner. And I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but the long and short of it is that seemingly Tony Stark was aware of what was going on, that basically this gamma explosion could potentially have disastrous results and could actually lead to something like this happening to Banner, or at least affecting him in some way. But because of that, when Banner had learned that truth, he blamed Iron Man for the fact that he became Hulk in the first place. That's what this is. It's kind of really Iron Man being revisited by all his sins, but it's also Iron Man having to come to terms in his battle against the entirety of the superhero community, right? To face his own demons is to face the superhero community, because time and time again, Iron Man has done nothing but in a lot of ways fail the superhero community. And so what ends up happening is one of the things that he's forced to endure is the death of his parents, right? Watching his parents die. But the Celestial even says that. It says, hey, some bad news here. With Whitney Frost-shaped exceptions, you're attracted to parental figures who provide a strong moral compass, because yours is absolutely whacked. I wonder where it comes from. And the reality here is that it comes from Howard and Maria Stark. Maria Stark kind of tried to do her best to a degree, but Howard Stark was exceedingly hard on Tony. And it was one of those things where it was always like, you can be better, you have to be better. Now, this is where the history gets a little murky, because if you go back and you read Kieran Gillen's run, The Secret Origin of Tony Stark, you learn that Tony's actually adopted by Howard and Maria, and their biological son is Arno, who is every bit as smart as Howard wanted him to be due to some genetic modifications and tampering. The whole Arno Stark thing just kind of seems to have taken a background and just sort of been wiped away by time, more or less, in Marvel Comics. They just haven't really told any stories about him. But the important distinction here is that in place of Arno, Tony was raised by Howard, and whether or not Arno's still even a part of the equation, the fact remains, Howard was always hard on Tony. He was very much a perfectionist. You can be better, so be better, right? Being like trying your best is not good enough. Be the best, right? Like, only fools make mistakes. And so it's one of those things where in the end, you have this amazing realization, because Tony Stark kind of comes clean in terms of why he even does what he does in the first place. He says, I always hoped it was an accident or an assassination, that people claimed that it was, or that mom and dad faked their deaths or something. That's what orphans do. We make up stories that give a bit of drama, right? That give a reason to why this happened. But in the end, it was just a car crash. people die for no reason at all. And in response, the Celestial says, you are mistaken. There was a reason. They died because a machine failed them. If only they had been in a better machine, a machine that could have protected them in this hell world. And that is the source of why Tony Stark does what he does. Because in the end, he initially tries to blow off the entirety of the Celestial and saying like, I've got work to do, right? I don't really have time for any of this nonsense. And the response of the Celestial is to basically appear as Howard Stark and to say, people die, son. I was a terrible father. We wanted you so badly. And then when we had you, I still wasn't great. We did a number on you and then we left you. We had so much we wanted to tell you and share and show, yet you keep on going. He says, I wouldn't have, most people wouldn't have. A broken machine keeps on ticking anyway. You're too hard on yourself, you pass. I couldn't be prouder of you, because it's Tony Stark confessing to the Celestial. That's why he does what he does. It's why he builds such advanced machines. It's why he builds Iron Man suits. It's why he goes on these crazy campaigns from time to time where he always has to be better, because it's one of those retroactive things. If he builds a better Iron Man suit, this time he can save his mom and dad, right? Building the most advanced Iron Man suit he can possibly can is like basically building a better car so his mom and dad wouldn't have died. He's chasing ghosts. There's no way for him to keep that from happening. I mean, I guess maybe he could invoke time travel, but that's never really been a major part of his story that's been explored. And honestly, I'd be kind of curious to see what would happen if it was. But the reality here is the death of Howard and Maria Stark played a significant role in the life and times of Tony, because them dying in a car crash was just that. And so once it's all said and done, he kind of emerges from this quote unquote antibody cocoon, if you want to call it that, but basically brought about by the Eternals and the X-Men and the rest of the Avengers and so on and so forth. And the thing about it is that he talks about how he met his dad, and his dad told him like, I'm proud of you. You've always become the person that I thought you would, and that sort of thing. So even if only on an emotional level, reconciling with his own father, and where it's initially brushed off by Mr. Sinister, the response of Iron Man is, no, like, you don't get it. It was testing me. And if it's still testing me, it's still testing us. And if it's still testing us, it means we have a chance to win. We have a chance to stave off the destruction of the planet. It's when that clock reaches zero, when the hand gets to midnight, then that's when we panic. But for right now, we're 5 minutes from annihilation, which means we have 5 minutes to save every living thing on Earth. So one of the things to remember is that when you have the kind of Unity Squad, which is basically what this is, Iron Man, Jean Grey, you do have like Logan and like some of the other Eternals who were here, this is their second attempt at a strike force. And this is what we talked about before. The first attempt at the strike force was to basically hit like what was essentially the kill switch for the progenitor Celestial. This one is more of trying to find a way to destroy it from the inside out. Now, initially they thought they could be sneaky and get on board, but the funny thing about this, and this just shows the level of power the progenitor Celestial has and its lack of concern, is that even when they're inside of it, it's still testing them. So the last video that we did focused on the test of Iron Man, of Tony Stark, testing his character to see whether or not he's worthy of surviving. With Jean Grey, it's much the same way here. The funny thing about this is that when this goes down, as they're making their way to the heart of the Celestial, so to speak, that Jean Grey's able to help them deal with some of the forces to a degree, but then her test begins, and she's suddenly yanked back to the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. Now, this is one of the cool moments, and there is a little bit of history here. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Jean Grey, when she initially appeared in Marvel Comics, she literally showed up in X-Men issue #1 and was kind of our eyes and ears as the reader, meaning she was given a tour of the entire grounds by Professor Xavier. She was told what the X-Men were, what their purpose is, why they do what they do, that kind of thing. But there was a story that was written later on by Chris Claremont in Bizarre Adventures issue #27. And what this did is it actually told us Xavier had been watching Jean Grey for quite some time. That this was actually included later on in the X-Men Origins Jean Grey one-shot, but the way the story was originally written is that when Jean Grey was a little girl, her friend Annie died. And when that happened, she kind of sent out this sort of telepathic shockwave, like an SOS, right? Like a telepathic scream of anguish, if you want to call it that. Xavier picked up on it, but so did the Phoenix Force. And both of them basically watched Jean Grey. The Phoenix Force watched her knowing that Jean Grey was the kind of person who would eventually become the host of the Phoenix, and Xavier watched her because he realized how powerful she was telepathically and telekinetically. And so this is why she was originally brought on the X-Men team. Now, unlike what we saw in the Iron Man one-shot that we covered in the last video, where it's strictly confined in the mind of Iron Man, this one actually shows us what other people are doing, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a jump back and forth. But the reality is, for the most part, they come to the consensus this is Jean Grey's test. Jean Grey has to be the one to endure it, but there will be a kind of stepping in that does take place. But the Celestial continuing to prod her mind, showing her these parts of herself and forcing her to confront these aspects that she had largely wanted to get rid of, it basically takes her mind to the Quiet Council when they were initially trying to decide what they were going to do with the progenitor Celestial. And the reality here is the discussion as it took place was a discussion of, okay, what's best for the world? How do we handle this? So on and so forth. The real meat and potatoes of this discussion was that the Quiet Council didn't really care how their actions impacted normal mutants who were out there, or even just regular human beings. Because ever since the process of resurrection was mastered by mutants, they've become very cavalier with the lives of mutants. And this manifests in the way in which the discussion is presented to Jean Grey. If we succeed, it will almost certainly kill untold millions of distinctly unfashionable dressed humans. But perhaps it's still a worthwhile use of our time. Of course, we won't tell the foot soldiers, no need for the little people to know. Anybody object? Please raise your hands. And it's one of those things where it's like, Jean Grey, you have blood on your hands, right? And that's the crazy thing, is because her response is, no, I left the Quiet Council because I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to actually do things that could make a difference. But the response of the progenitor Celestial here is, that may be, but you left the position that gave you the best chance of doing so. The best thing you could have done was stay on the Quiet Council. They're the ones who make the decisions. Leaving a position of power under the guise of wanting to affect actual change, that's a lie. It's a lie you tell yourself, and it's a lie you tell the world. What you did, Jean Grey, was an act of hubris. You wanted to be the hero, so you cooked up some kind of an excuse that made you feel better, and now you get to go out there and be the hero. And so she initially, again, tries to reject this idea of mind games, and so there actually comes a point when Mr. Sinister brings himself and Wolverine into his mind, or into the mind of the Celestial and the mind of Jean Grey. And what it does is it allows the Celestial to scan the two of them as what are basically character witnesses. And that's the cool thing, is because initially it goes for Sinister, and it's like, tell me what you think about Jean Grey, honestly. And Sinister doesn't really love Jean Grey, and never really has. When it came to Sinister as a person, his fascination with Jean Grey was based on her genealogy. Remember, the old school basis behind Sinister, despite the fact that it's changed in more recent years, has been that Sinister knew, or came to the realization, that if Jean Grey and Cyclops were to ever have a child, that child would be godly in terms of power. One of the things he says here is, he says, I cloned Jean Grey, and I couldn't clone Jean Grey. I made something else several times, some better than others, but none annoyingly better than her. What he's referencing here is when he created Madeline Pryor. Madeline Pryor was the attempt by Sinister to clone Jean Grey. The problem he ran into is he could clone Jean Grey in terms of her physical appearance, but he couldn't clone the essence of what made her who she was, or even her powers. That's why Madeline Pryor was never on the same level as Jean, and that's why she was considered a failed experiment by Sinister. When it comes to Wolverine, it's much simpler than that. Wolverine loves Jean Grey, so he will never speak ill of her because he doesn't see her in any way but a positive light. And that's when everything shifts and you get this amazing moment in this comic. So at that point, the Celestial whisks away Sinister and Wolverine and is like, enough. He says their insight helps. One who loves you and one who envies you. Yes, I think I understand now, or at least I understand enough. I met your husband Cyclops. He implied that I should be scared of you. A man who loves you thinks that something like me should be afraid of you. He is married to something that on a fundamental level scares the hell out of him. Such bravery. Of course, I passed him. He sleeps in the lair of a red dragon, and I think he's right. I think you are like me. Now, this is where things get really awesome, and this is where the Celestial sort of looks at Jean Grey and says, we're similar, but we're starkly different at the same time. He says, and for the love you share and provoke, that is the part I cannot get past. Yes, I am destroying a world, but you destroyed a world for no reason at all. And her response is, Dark Phoenix was not me. It was, but it's really complicated. Now, to explain this, because I imagine a lot of you guys who aren't really familiar with the X-Men mythos are a little confused by this. When Chris Claremont took over writing of the X-Men back in the 70s, his idea was that Jean Grey was a character that had been underutilized in every capacity, but he also wanted to move past the original X-Men team and basically create a team of his own. Hence the reason why he built on Len Wein's giant size his X-Men run. But the idea behind this is that he wanted to elevate Jean Grey to basically make up for how her character had been treated and then ride her out in a blaze of glory. So he gave us the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas, right? Jean Grey attains this godly level of power, she ends up going insane, and then she sacrifices her life for the good of everybody. The problem was that Jean Grey was so ridiculously popular during that time that Marvel editorial made Chris Claremont bring Jean Grey back. But what Marvel did is they said that when Jean Grey initially got the Phoenix Force, that what the Phoenix had done was actually copy Jean Grey, and the real Jean Grey was just sitting in the bottom of Jamaica Bay. She was ultimately discovered by the Fantastic Four, and the Fantastic Four brought her to the X-Men, and then what Marvel established was that when the Phoenix had all that power, it was actually the Phoenix Force pretending to be Jean Grey. When the Phoenix went nuts and became the Dark Phoenix, that it was never actually Jean Grey, it was just the Phoenix had lost its mind and looked like Jean Grey. It was basically a way to exonerate Jean of everything that she'd done. It still holds true. Marvel's never gone back and changed that, and they probably never will. But that's what she's referencing here. Now, the funny thing is the Celestial responds in saying, yes, sometimes you are a saint, Jean Grey, but at other times you are a violent bully. And above all, once you destroyed a world. And that's the thing, like she initially says, and I'm going to destroy you, and the Celestial says, and again, violence. Now, she responds, of course, in making the best argument she can. She says, listen, last month alone, I went to a casino where countless worlds' fates were being wagered on. I saved untold numbers of worlds. If I were keeping score, I'm in the black. And the response of the Celestial is, yes, you went to this place where people were betting on ways to destroy worlds, but your friends would have saved those worlds without you, and they have not burned at all. So basically the response he's making here is, you cannot use that as some kind of a justification for all the terrible things you've done, and said, look, I destroyed an entire world. I killed countless billions, which in reality, she destroyed an entire star system is actually what happened. But like, she's like, you know, yes, I killed all those terrible people, but look at this great thing I did here. I did this great thing here, and that should atone for it. That should make up for it. I've tried to be a hero all this time. And the response of the Celestial is, no, that's not how this works. She asked the question, like, what can I possibly do to make up for this? And the response of the Celestial is, you can never make up for this, Jean Grey. You are the Phoenix now and forever. And the Phoenix effectively rebonds itself, or seemingly rebonds itself, with Jean Grey in the process. But literally what this means is that Jean Grey, when seemingly she was the Dark Phoenix, what this is Marvel doing is seemingly coming back and saying, actually, that was Jean Grey, right? We're undoing all that stuff where it wasn't actually her. That was Jean Grey. She was the Dark Phoenix. It wasn't the Dark Phoenix replacing her or copying her. That was Jean Grey. And she did destroy that entire star system. She did kill all those people. There's nothing you can do to atone for it. And the actions of Jean Grey over the course of all this time after the events of the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix saga was never about her trying to atone for what she'd done. It was never about her saying, okay, yes, I did that, and I'm trying to make amends, right? Because given the various heights of her power, she could have brought those worlds back. She could have returned those worlds during like Phoenix End Song, Phoenix War Song, right? When she was at the peak of her power, when she was in the white hot room, the white Phoenix of the Crown, she could have fixed her past mistakes. But the reality is she didn't, because it was never about atoning for her action. It was never about making up for her past misdeeds. She, like so many of us out here in the real world, it was just about making herself feel better about what she'd done. It was selfish. That's all it was. It was, I did a really bad thing and I want to feel better about the fact that I did it, so I'm going to do a lot of good things and it'll even out, right? Like the scales will be tipped, maybe in my favor, but at the very least, they'll be balanced, right? Like, you know, it won't be as bad, or it won't be so terrible. That's literally what it was. What this progenitor Celestial is forcing her to face is the fact that it doesn't work that way. Just because you did a terrible thing does not mean you get to do an equally good thing and everything balances out and all is forgiven and the day is saved. The fact and the reality is you did a terrible thing. You did a horrible thing. It's great that you did a great thing to try to make up for it, but it doesn't change the fact that you did that horrible thing. You cannot atone for this. You cannot make up for this. You can't rinse this blood off your hands. And all the actions that you've engaged in since then have just been selfish actions. So again, it's really amazing here because once Jean Grey snaps back and she's back to her normal self, she actually kind of swears out this blood feud on the progenitor Celestial. And what's so ironic about this is she learned nothing from that test. She learned absolutely nothing at all. The basis of the test was to teach her you have to learn to make up for the things that you've done. What she's doing here is she's saying, I'm going to destroy you. In effect, the progenitor celestial confronted her with the reality she doesn't like, and like anybody on Twitter or Reddit or Facebook or just social media in general, she's choosing to reject the reality of the situation that she's in and replace it with one that she finds more agreeable. So she basically lashes out at the celestial and is like, I'm going to destroy you in your entirety. Yes, I am the Phoenix, and yes, I harbor the power of the Phoenix, and by hell or high water, I will destroy you, right? I will end you in your entirety. So it's an amazing comic with a really kind of sad ending for the character of Jean, because again, she learns absolutely nothing. What this does is this basically leads to the progenitor kind of initiating the end of the world, starting the process of wiping everything out. Now, one of the things the progenitor celestial was establishing was that the world itself was pushing back, right? In the sense that the world didn't want to end. And of course, you also have the superheroes who are fighting against the progenitor itself. Now, as for the world, we're not really given a whole lot of indication there. One of the theories that some of you guys have come up with is that it's actually the island of Krakoa, like the actual island itself, that is helping in its way to fight against the progenitor. But also remember, Captain America was brought back by the Five, right? By the mutants. And again, that's something that they don't do. They don't bring back a human. They only ever bring back mutants. It was part of their charter, right? They're very much self-isolated. But with Captain America's return, what it does is it starts to rally people. And so for a time, the Earth superheroes really have kind of humanity on their side. Everything is set aside as far as a truce goes between the Eternals and the Avengers and the X-Men, so on and so forth. Things are kind of working out well. But what's ironic about this is that there are a few holdouts here and there. For example, one of the things we talk about is this guy named Tom, right? He's one of the humans that we've seen in the story so far, a guy with red hair. While the world is ending, right, following the judgment of the Celestial, which really is too late for unification, or at least it seems, that portals were being opened by the Eternals around the world that could get people to safety. Tom chose not to take it, and in fact, he kept his family with him, and the result is that his family and himself are basically gonna die because of all this, right? So literally, his selfishness doomed his family, right? Doomed him and his family. And it's just one of those things where people are responding in different ways. Some are hopeful, some are terrified, some are very, very cynical. But the thing about this is that with Captain America returning, when he comes in, one of the things that Nightcrawler talks about is how Iron Man, Jean Grey, the Eternals, or at least a handful of the Eternals, that they are inside the Celestial itself trying to find a way to bring it down. And the response of Captain America is that could work unless it decides to change tactics. And it will decide to change tactics. And that's exactly what the progenitor says. Like, yes, I'm going to change tactics, right? Like the reality here is the Earth is fighting against me. I cannot destroy it with conventional means or with the means a Celestial normally would, but I will simply go to the reality loom, right? Literally the core of the world and the thing that keeps it together. So what we're talking about here is the equivalent of holding a glass together with glue, right? What the progenitor is going to do is undo that glue. There's nothing to hold the glass together and it's all going to fall apart. That's what's going to happen here, right? Literally, he's going to destroy the world from the inside out, just obliterate the planet. And he literally does that, right? Like rips the planet open through a fissure and then starts the process of destroying it that way. Now, on the inside of the Celestial, this is where things get interesting. And this is where I say, I think the ending of this story might be controversial. I mean, controversial insofar as like the ending of a comic book, right? I mean, it's a comic, right? It's a fictional story. But the thing about this is you end up having like Iron Man, right? You've got Jean Grey, you've got all these guys here who are consistently facing off against the antibodies of the Celestial, but they finally get to its core, right? Its heart, if you want to call it that. And when they get there, the progenitor just doesn't really seem to notice them at all, may not even be aware of the fact that they're there, but it's basically going through and trying to find a way to end everything. Now, what's cool is Jean Grey, because of her test and the fact that she'd failed, right? Because she was forced to really accept the fact that she, as the Dark Phoenix, had committed heinous acts. And it's one of the things we talked about in the previous video. She was forced to confront a reality she didn't want to confront. And the result of that is that it made her angry. It basically drives her to lash against the Celestial. But that's when basically Ajax steps in and actually takes Jean Grey out. She doesn't kill her, but she incapacitates Jean Grey and stops her. And the reason why is because from the perspective of Ajax, this is all simply just a test, right? This is all a test that's being performed by the progenitor. And the progenitor even says, I mean, I kind of stopped testing, but I'm always watching, right? Almost as if it doesn't really want to annihilate everything. And so what's kind of cool is that on the outside, you do have the Avengers kind of doing what they can, right? You do have different people out there, but you have like humanity that's also unified against the progenitor as well. Now that's just the beginning because the numbers are going to increase. And in fact, it's really going to become cool here in a second. But what ends up going on is Captain America approaches the progenitor and says, like, sure, like, I can't necessarily stop you, but this is your last warning. You can surrender, right? You can quit, which is kind of interesting that Captain America approaches the progenitor like he would a normal person. And when the progenitor says, you don't have the power to stop me, the response to Steve Rogers is, sure, but I can distract you. And this basically leads to a partially returned sign. Now, for those of you guys who missed the early parts of the story, when the initial war between the Eternals and the Avengers and the X-Men kicked off, it was really more the Eternals versus the X-Men. What we ended up learning is that the Hex are basically these Eternals that are just ridiculously powerful, right? And the reality is we didn't really know about them before, but they're colossal in size. Now, the Hex itself, or at least Sign itself, is only partially formed, but Sign is operating as a vector. And in fact, Sign is operating as a vector for the most powerful mutants on Earth at this moment right now. The thing here, though, is that Sign is basically operating kind of an allegiance with like Exodus, because Exodus was the Omega level mutant that initially destroyed Sign, and there was a kind of a respect that built there. And so while Sign's not powerful enough to kill the progenitor, it is powerful enough to basically offer a distraction and keep it from going through with like destroying the world in the moment. And so what it does is it switches back to the inside of the progenitor with Jean Grey and Tony Stark and these different guys. And what ends up happening is Jean Grey, her initial response in trying to destroy it is met by Tony Stark, who actually ends up becoming the voice of reason, which you would never expect. It's kind of weird to see that, but it's one of the things where he says, okay, stop and think, right? And this was Ajax's point, right? Say, for example, we kill this progenitor celestial right now, right? Say we kill this thing in its heart, we eradicate it. Then what happens? The world's saved, but all the billions of people who were killed in its judgment, they're still gone. Right? They're still out. There's no way to bring them back. And so initially it's kind of like, okay, well then how do we pull that off? Because Stark's response is there has to be another way. Now, this is where things get interesting. We don't see a lot of it. Orcus gets involved. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Orcus is largely a super secretive organization that's composed of like Hydra, advanced idea mechanics, humans, so on and so forth, but they're staunchly against and trying to find a way to eradicate the mutant population. But they have Nimrod on their side, and they have Sentinels, and what would have been amazing to see is a tie-in comic where Nimrod and Orcus and the Sentinels face off against the progenitor celestial to see how they fare. Because remember, when it comes to Nimrod, he has the ability to analyze the weakness of anybody he sees and then adapt his powers to overcome that weakness. So there is a legitimate possibility here that while Nimrod would not be powerful enough to destroy the progenitor, it could put up one hell of a fight, but we didn't get that, and I'm kind of pissed. I feel like Marvel should come back and just do like a retroactive one-shot, right? And just give us that story, because it would have been phenomenal to see. But the thing about this is that where Jean Grey initially tries to blow off the reactions of Tony Stark and all that, initially she's like, here's the thing, it may very well be a test, whatever, it doesn't matter. She tries to attack the progenitor, and the progenitor, of course, disables her attack, and it says, of course it's a test, right? Like, I was questioning myself, but I have learned that you do deserve to die. All of you here on this world deserve to die. You remain creatures guided solely by self-interest. You mutants would kill me as you have less stakes. Some of your numbers would cheer as loudly as the humans cheered your deaths. Those who hate you stand with you only because there is no other choice. If there was, they would take it. And the Eternals, even when free, prove they cannot change. The overall statement that it's making here is that there is no unification. It looks like it is. It looks like you guys have banded together under a singular cause, but you haven't, right? You're doing it because there is no other option, right? Like, you're working together because there is no other option. You're not doing it because you want to. You're doing it because you have to. And there is a huge distinction there, an immense distinction there, right? Wants and needs, right? Expediency versus necessity, that kind of a thing, right? That's what we're talking about here. And that's what the progenitor celestial was looking for. But this is where things get really, really interesting. Tony Stark, ever the rationalist, right? And even like the Eternals themselves, what ends up happening is you actually have Cersei that basically broadcasts to the world, and she reveals the truth to the world itself. And what she says is that as Eternals, the long kept secret that we've kept away from you guys, or the thing that we've always hidden, even though some of you are aware of our existence, is that every time one of us dies, one of you normal humans humans dies to bring us back. It's the curse of our existence, but we've known about it for millions of years. We simply just never told you. But now is the time for clarity, right? If we are going to really step forward, and if we are going to be a race that guides humanity, then it's important that you understand both the good and the bad of everything that we are. And so in basically providing that revelation to humanity, humans respond exactly the way that you think they would. And it's one of those things where literally Cersei was doing this just to prove a point that Eternals can change. They've been doing this for like millions of years. So that seemingly discards the one reality, or at least the aspect of Eternals that the progenitor celestial held on to, that Eternals can't change. But in response, Tony Stark steps up, and Tony Stark says, here's the thing, none of your judgments make sense. And this is one of the best things about the story, because it's kind of Kieran Gillen taking the progenitor celestial and putting it in place of like cancel culture or something like that, right? And basically saying, here's the thing, you have arbitrarily and for no reason other than whatever reason you decided on your own, put yourself in a position where you believe that you are a moral judgment for the world, but you're not, right? You as the progenitor celestial are an amalgamation of us. You are quite literally created by us as just fallible, broken human beings, which means it stands to reason that your line of logic or your ability to come to these logical conclusions are just as flawed and just as infallible for us as people, right? So if you are as screwed up as we are, then who are you to make such claims as to be some kind of absolute moral authority? You're not, right? You're just a person out there ranting and raving about things that you don't agree with. And that's literally calling the celestial out in that way. It's not enough to bring the event down in its entirety, but it is enough for the progenitor celestial to actually listen, because there is truth in the words of Tony Stark. But then Jean Grey steps up and says, here's the thing, you're about to eradicate an entire world. And it is time that I come to terms with the fact that I did eradicate a whole world, even though, again, Jean Grey obliterated an entire star system, right? A whole solar system. Is her coming to grips with that, and then in saying, if you do this, this is something that you can't come back from. There's no undoing this, right? You can't unring this bell. You will have to live with this. And if you were just any normal celestial out there, it wouldn't matter, because it would just be your role. You wouldn't really care. You would have been doing it for ages and ages, and that's fine. That's the role those celestials play, right? Arishem the judge and Xeron the tester or whatever. That's their place. That's their role. But if you do this, you will be no better than us, right? And you will have to live with this for the rest of your life. And what it does is it actually gives the progenitor celestial the ability to step back and look at the situation. Now, that's the controversial part, because I imagine people are just kind of like, really, right? Kindness and happiness is what brought this event to an end? Yes and no. So here's the cool thing that happens, right? The progenitor realizing that it's not really a god as it sees itself, right? That it's not really an absolute authority. Coming to this realization that because it is flawed, built by flawed people, that it cannot be an absolute judgment of what's right and what's wrong, because the people who built it don't have an absolute judgment of what's right and what's wrong. And its judgment is modeled after their judgment. And so in response to that, what it does is it basically brings back everybody who was destroyed, right? It brings back everybody who died. And then it asks the question, like, am I worthy of living, right? Like, given everything that's happened, would you judge in favor of me or against me? And that's literally when Ajak judges against it. And when that happens, it merges itself with Ajak, and the two of them are effectively reborn and then take off to Avengers Mountain. Now, following this, with the day more or less being saved, Ajak does return, but as a whole new being. She has a whole new level of power, but she's also one half the progenitor celestial. So she kind of speaks for it right now. This is why I say it feels like a move on a chessboard, because the actual climax, the event itself, does end with a whimper. I won't deny that, right? Like, I was expecting some great big huge grandiose conflict, but honestly, that grandiose conflict has been happening for the last 3 videos that we've made. So you can kind of see how this is just sort of the tail ending of it all. But the thing about this is that as the progenitor looks out on the world, what we end up finding out here is that not everything has changed for the better. That where you had humanity being faced to force its impending demise, that not everybody looked at those impending demise as like, this is a chance for me to turn over a new leaf. For Tom, it kind of does to a degree, right? His family lives again. His son asks, you know, hey, what happened? Like, I thought the world was ending, and he tries to explain it to his son, but he's trying to have more involvement in his family's life as opposed to ignoring them. But for a girl named Katrina, because of the fact that she had sacrificed her life for all these different people, it wasn't some Jesus Christ-esque situation, but enough to where it was noticed by way of the progenitor from humanity that instead of her being humble about it, she's actually become arrogant about it, right? That she's a little smug because of her actions, like, yeah, man, you guys all need to bend the knee to me. And because of that, what it shows is that a lot of people out there are still really crappy. Humanity, I wouldn't say humanity as a whole, but humanity still hasn't necessarily learned. But here's the big kicker behind all this, and this is why I say I feel like something bigger's coming, which we do know that it is because of like Thanos with Mjolnir with the Infinity Stones and the hammer and leading an army of zombies, because don't forget, that was something that that Donny Cates teased in his early Thor run. Like, that's coming. Right, Thanos bringing an end to everything again, but like that's gonna happen. I just don't know exactly when. What we end up getting here is in the aftermath of everything, there is a treaty that's formed between the Eternals and the mutant population, right? So now they're working together, which means the mutant population, in whatever conflict that they're in, invoking the treaty of the Eternals, they have Uranos on their side. And remember, in 1 hour, Uranos eradicated 98% of Araco on Mars, a planet whose population is 100% Omega level mutants, right? Literally just all Omega level mutants, most powerful mutants there. He eradicated 98% of them in an hour, right? So like they have him on their side now. Now, it's one of those cool things because following that, what you also end up getting is the X-Men that actually open their borders to the world in saying that with all those people out there who die, they didn't back up every single human mind because it wasn't necessarily their custom, but they can bring back some. But it's more them sort of opening the idea of resurrection to the rest of the world and saying like, we're not going to do it willy-nilly. We're not going to bring back just any swinging dick because, you know, like you come to us and you ask us to bring back a person, but you have no real good reason for why that person should exist. We may or may not bring them back. Right, you know, but if like some person who was on the verge of curing cancer just turns blue and kills over from a heart attack, yeah, we'll probably bring them back because their work was for the benefit of humanity, that kind of a thing. But ultimately, it's one of those where the story kind of ends in a way where it is, in effect, the progenitor celestial kind of standing out there and watching out onto the world and saying like, I will never stop judging you. A time will come when we will enact this again, right? A time will come when we will come back. I will come back and I will judge against all of you, or I will judge in favor of you. But all you've done here in this Avengers versus X-Men event, all you've done was temporarily staved off annihilation. That's it. But once my judgment is fully complete, once the progenitor realized that it wasn't able to effectively judge humanity over the course of a day, once it's like, I will judge you for the long term and I will compare your progress or your regression in the future to your current state now, then I will make my judgment accordingly. And when that time comes, there will be no stopping me. There will be no way to stave off the ending of things. That will definitively happen, and the earth will either live or it will be destroyed, and that will be it. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.